The cold steel bars creaked as John McAllister shuffled toward the prison yard, his footsteps heavy with the weight of years spent in a place he didn't belong. His back was hunched, the exhaustion of wrongful imprisonment etched into his every movement. It was just another day, another hour, in a life he never chose, one filled with regret, anger, and an all-consuming desire for justice. But today felt different. Today, something was about to change. John stopped at the edge of the yard, the distant sounds of other inmates murmuring like the backdrop to a never-ending nightmare. He stared at the sky, a dull gray as always, the oppressive walls of the prison towering around him. His life, once filled with purpose as a cop, fighting for the law, protecting the innocent, now felt like a far-off memory. The world outside had moved on, but he had been locked away for a crime he didn't commit. The past 7 years had stolen everything from him: his career, his family, and his sense of who he was. "Why me?" he whispered to the wind, his voice barely audible. "What did I do to deserve this?" The days bled together, indistinguishable from one another, as he spent every waking hour fighting to keep his hope alive. His family, Sarah, his wife, and their daughter Emily, had visited him in the early days, but soon the letters and phone calls stopped. His case was lost in the legal system. The world had moved on, but John had not. He still believed he could clear his name. A sudden shout from across the yard broke his thoughts. "McAllister!" John's head snapped to the side, and his heart skipped a beat. There, standing near the guard's tower, was a figure he never expected to see. Elon Musk. It had been years since John had heard that name, but it didn't make sense. How could the billionaire entrepreneur, the founder of SpaceX and Tesla, be here? A part of him wondered if his mind had started playing tricks on him, or if this was just another dream in the nightmare of his life. He watched as Elon approached the fence, the usual calm expression on his face, but with a hint of urgency in his eyes. He was no longer the unreachable tech mogul on television or in the news. No, now he was a man with a purpose, a man who had come for him. John's heart raced, confusion flooding his senses. Was this real? Was this some kind of sick joke? Elon had been following John's case for years. That much was clear from the occasional news report and blog post that he'd read in the prison library. But why now? Why after all this time? John's fingers gripped the wire of the fence, the rough texture biting into his skin as his emotions clashed with the impossible reality in front of him. His mind tried to process what was happening. Elon Musk, standing here, talking to me? John mumbled, half to himself. "John McAllister," Elon called out, his voice steady. "You're not here because of something you did. You're here because of something someone else did. But I'm here to help you get out." John felt his breath catch in his chest, his throat tight with disbelief. You want to help me?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why would you want to help me? I'm just a cop." Elon's gaze softened, his eyes locking with John's through the gap in the fence. "I've been following your case. I've seen the evidence. I know you didn't do it. I want to help clear your name. I'm not just some billionaire throwing money at a problem. I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do." John shook his head, still struggling to process the words. It was too much to take in at once. "But how?" Elon smiled, a hint of determination flashing in his eyes. "I've got resources, lawyers, experts, tech tools. We can expose what happened here. We can fight for your freedom. But I need you to trust me, John. This is your chance to make it right." John looked at the man before him, wondering if he was dreaming. This felt like a cruel trick, a glimmer of hope that would be snatched away just as quickly. How could he trust someone like Elon Musk, someone who seemed to have everything he could ever want, while John had lost it all? But then, something inside him stirred, a small, fragile flame of hope that he hadn't felt in years. What if this was real? What if this was his chance to make everything right? He had nothing left to lose, and maybe, just maybe, this was his shot at redemption. "I don't know if I can trust you," John said, his voice shaking. "But I've spent too long in here, fighting a system that's never going to listen. If there's a chance, any chance, of getting out, I'll take it." Elon nodded, his expression resolute. "Then let's make it happen." The prison guards were watching them closely now, but neither man seemed to care. For the first time in years, John felt a glimmer of something he hadn't dared to feel: hope. And that's when he made the decision that would change everything. "I don't care how it happens," John said, his voice steadier now. "I'll do whatever it takes to clear my name. But there's one thing I need. One thing I've always needed since this nightmare started." Elon raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to continue. "I want to hug you," John said, his eyes locking onto Elon's. "One last time. If this is real, if you're really here to help me, I just need that one moment. To feel like maybe, just maybe, I can get my life back." The words hung in the air for a moment, heavy with emotion. Elon didn't hesitate. Without a word, he reached through the fence, extending his hand. John grabbed it, his grip firm, feeling something surge within him: hope, determination, and a sense of purpose that had been absent for far too long. "I'll get you out of here, John," Elon said softly. "We'll do this together." John closed his eyes for a moment, overwhelmed by the unexpected turn of events. Maybe he wasn't alone anymore. Maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something bigger than himself. And as Elon's hand held his, John felt something shift within him. This wasn't just about freedom. It was about redemption. And the journey ahead would be one he would never have expected. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? John McAllister had never imagined a life like this. He had always seen himself as a protector, a man who had chosen a career in law enforcement because it gave him purpose. When he was a kid, he had always been the one to defend the underdog, standing up for what was right, even if it meant going against the grain. Becoming a cop was natural for him. It wasn't just about wearing the badge. It was about making a difference in a world that often seemed unjust. Born and raised in a small town outside of Chicago, John had grown up in a tight-knit community where people knew each other by name. He wasn't the most outgoing guy, but people trusted him. He had the kind of personality that drew others in, and they felt safe around him. It was no surprise when, at 22, he joined the police academy, eager to make a mark on the world. He was determined to protect the people who had raised him, who had helped shape him into the man he was. In his early years on the force, John was just another rookie, learning the ropes. But it wasn't long before he proved himself. His attention to detail, his ability to remain calm under pressure, and his natural instincts made him stand out. He quickly rose through the ranks, eventually landing a position on a special task force that focused on organized crime in the city. This was where John truly felt like he was making a difference. Working in the high-stakes world of undercover operations, John developed a reputation as someone who could be trusted, someone who wouldn't back down in the face of danger. He earned the respect of his peers, and soon, he became a well-known figure in the department. He was on his way to something bigger. He could feel it. He was about to make a real change, not just in Chicago, but in the entire justice system. But that all came crashing down when he was framed for a crime he didn't commit. It was a simple mistake. At least, that's what he had thought at first. John had been working undercover, infiltrating a group of criminals, gathering intelligence that could take down a major drug cartel. He had done everything right. He had been careful, methodical, never compromising his integrity. But someone had other plans. One day, after a successful operation, John found himself at the wrong place at the wrong time. A crime was committed, a robbery followed by a murder, and for reasons he still couldn't understand, the evidence pointed straight to him. Fingerprints were found at the scene. A witness identified him, and, worst of all, a video surfaced of him at the crime scene. It was clear as day. The jury convicted him without a second thought. No one, not even his closest colleagues, believed he was innocent. The entire system had turned its back on him. John's world shattered in an instant. But it wasn't just the people in his professional life who had abandoned him. His personal life was destroyed too. Sarah, his wife, was devastated. She had stood by him through his career, through the late nights, the missed anniversaries, and the constant danger. But when the accusations came out, she couldn't handle the pressure. She was left with a young daughter, Emily, and a life she had never expected to live. The public eye was unforgiving, and soon, Sarah withdrew, emotionally and physically. She stopped visiting John, stopped answering his calls, and eventually stopped writing letters. John had begged her to stay, pleaded for her to believe in him, but the world had become too cruel. Sarah filed for divorce. His daughter, Emily, was growing up without him. Every day, John sat alone in his cell, wondering if he would ever see them again. As he sat in his small, dimly lit cell that night, John allowed himself a rare moment of weakness. The weight of his past mistakes, the false conviction, the loss of his family, and the feeling of being utterly alone, all settled on his shoulders. He thought about Emily, how old she must be now, what she must have been told about him. "Did she forget me?" he muttered to himself. "Am I just a ghost to her now?" He stared out of the small, barred window, seeing nothing but the dark sky above. His heart ached for his daughter, but more than anything, he wished he could undo the past. He wished he could clear his name and show the world that he had never been guilty. John had tried everything in his power to prove his innocence. He had filed appeals. He had contacted every lawyer who would listen, but the system was broken. No one cared about the truth. It was too easy to leave him in here, to let him rot while those responsible for the crime he had been accused of continued to walk free. And yet, through it all, John had not lost hope. There were days, of course, when he wondered if he was fooling himself, wondering if the truth would ever come to light. But deep down, he knew he couldn't give up. The man he used to be, the cop who had fought for justice, wouldn't let that happen. It was on one of those long, quiet nights, in the deepest corner of his mind, that he decided to fight one last time. He didn't know how or when, but he swore he would clear his name. He would not die in prison, not as a convicted criminal, not after everything he had done for the people he swore to protect. It was just a matter of finding a way out. Then, as if the universe had been listening, the letter arrived. The letter that would change everything. The one with Elon Musk's name on it. John had read the words over and over again, hardly believing what he was seeing. Elon Musk, the billionaire entrepreneur, was offering his help. The letter promised resources, lawyers, and technology to expose the corruption that had led to John's conviction. At first, John thought it was a joke. A sick joke, perhaps. But no, the letter was real. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized that this might be his only shot at freedom. The wheels of justice had not turned for him, but maybe, just maybe, they could turn with Elon's help. John McAllister stood in the prison yard, feeling the weight of what Elon Musk had just offered him. A part of him couldn't believe it. This was not supposed to happen. The billionaire entrepreneur who had changed the world with his companies was standing outside these prison walls, ready to help him clear his name. It was the kind of turn of fate that John couldn't have even imagined in his wildest dreams. But as the initial rush of hope began to settle in, the reality of the situation hit him. Nothing about this was going to be easy. John had spent 7 years in this place, and in those years, the system had already decided who he was, a criminal, a guilty man. No matter how much he had protested his innocence, no one had listened. The world had condemned him, and now, even with Elon's offer, John knew the fight for his freedom would be a battle against everything he had ever known. "Are you sure you want to do this, Elon?" John asked, his voice hoarse as he tried to make sense of what was happening. He couldn't help but wonder if this was some kind of grand illusion, a mistake, a game. Elon's face remained calm, but there was a determination in his eyes. "Yes," he said, his voice unwavering. "This isn't just about getting you out of here. It's about exposing the truth. It's about righting a wrong that's been overlooked for far too long. You didn't do this, and I'll help you prove it." For a moment, John just stared at him. The words didn't seem real. He wanted to believe. He desperately needed to believe. But his years in prison had made him cynical. Trust wasn't something he could give away easily anymore. "I don't know what you're thinking, but this isn't going to be a simple fix," John said, pacing slightly as he tried to get his bearings. "Even if you bring in the best lawyers, the best experts, we're still dealing with a system that doesn't care about the truth. It's about the reputation of the police, the court system, the city. It's all so corrupt. They'll never admit they were wrong." Elon didn't flinch. "I know," he said, the weight of his words settling in the air between them. But that's why I'm here. We don't have to rely on the system that failed you. We're going to take a different approach. We'll use the resources I have, the tech we can access, and we'll find the truth no matter how deep it's buried. John felt a flicker of hope deep within him, but it was quickly met with skepticism. Elon had resources, yes. He had power, wealth, and influence. But what about the people who had framed him? What about the ones who had built a case around his guilt, painting him as a villain to the public? There were still powerful forces at play, and John had learned the hard way that no amount of truth could overcome corruption when it was backed by money and influence. You don't understand, John said, shaking his head. They've already written me off. No one is going to listen to a man who's been locked up for 7 years for a crime he didn't commit. And even if they do, what's to say they'll care? This is bigger than me. Elon's eyes narrowed slightly. That's exactly why we need to fight. You're not just fighting for yourself, John. You're fighting for the truth. And the truth doesn't care about the powerful people who want to keep it buried. John hesitated. Could Elon's confidence be the key he needed to unlock his freedom? The world had already turned its back on him, but maybe, just maybe, this was his shot at redemption. But before he could respond, the sharp clang of the prison gates interrupted their conversation. The guards were signaling that it was time for John to return to his cell. Elon looked at him for a moment, then nodded as if they both knew what needed to happen next. "We'll be in touch," Elon said quietly, a finality in his tone. "And when we do, you're going to need to trust me. This is bigger than anything you've faced before. But I believe in you. You've got more fight in you than you know." John watched Elon turn and walk away, the figure of the billionaire quickly disappearing into the distance. For the first time in years, John felt like something had shifted. The chains of his past, the lies, the years of despair. Somehow, they didn't seem as heavy anymore. There was still so much to fight for, and if Elon Musk believed in him, then maybe, just maybe, he could win this battle. As John returned to his cell, his mind raced. How could he prepare for what was to come? He had to be ready for the fight of his life. But even more than that, he had to hold on to the one thing he hadn't let go of during all these years: hope. Later that night, as he lay in his bed, John couldn't sleep. His thoughts kept drifting to Elon's words. Trust. They were words he hadn't heard in a long time. Trust was a rare commodity when you had been betrayed by everyone you loved and every institution you had sworn to uphold. But now, in the midst of the cold, unfeeling prison walls, John couldn't help but wonder, was this his chance to get everything back? Could he really clear his name? The next morning, the prison routine felt different. John stood before the grimy mirror in his cell, staring at his reflection. The man who had been sentenced to life in prison for a crime he didn't commit had finally been given a glimmer of hope. But with that hope came something else: fear. Fear of failure. Fear of being let down once again. But as he turned to leave his cell, a single thought pushed through the fear. I have nothing left to lose. The days after Elon Musk's visit felt both like a blur and an eternity to John McAllister. It had been almost a week since their conversation in the prison yard, and despite his best efforts to stay focused, his mind kept drifting back to that moment. The hope Elon had instilled in him was both exhilarating and terrifying. But John knew one thing for certain. He was no longer the man who had given up. He was a man with a mission. Every morning, John spent hours pacing his cell, trying to figure out how to prepare himself for the fight ahead. The challenge was so immense that it made him dizzy just thinking about it. Clear his name, expose the corruption, fight against the system that had already condemned him. But he knew that Elon's promise of help was the only way forward. Without him, there was no chance. John had spent years on the inside, years becoming familiar with every corner of the prison, every officer's routine, every guard's predictable shift. He had developed a finely tuned sense of how things worked here, but nothing in his previous experience had prepared him for this new reality. The system he had once worked within, the one he had trusted to do the right thing, had turned its back on him. He had been betrayed by the very thing he had spent his life defending. But now, there was a new force at play: Elon Musk and his resources. For the first time, John wasn't fighting alone. Over the next few days, the prison buzzed with rumors. rumors about MacAllister getting help from a billionaire. The inmates, most of whom were stuck in their own hopeless cycles, couldn't help but speculate. The whispers were loud enough for John to overhear as he passed other prisoners. Some seemed envious. Some saw it as a joke. Others, more cynical, thought it would never happen. John didn't care about their opinions. All he cared about was whether this slim chance could really work. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, Elon was hard at work. John had received a few cryptic phone calls from his new team of lawyers, a group of highly skilled professionals Elon had put together. They were already sifting through his case, finding holes, looking for ways to challenge the false evidence that had been used to convict him. They had assured him that the case was winnable, that the truth was still out there, buried beneath layers of corruption. They just had to find it. John knew, deep down, that this battle wasn't just about his freedom. It was about more than that. It was about proving that the truth mattered, proving that a man could be innocent, even if the world had already sentenced him. One afternoon, as he was seated in the prison's library, John received a letter from Elon. His heart skipped a beat as he tore open the envelope. "MacAllister, we've reviewed the evidence, and I can tell you right now, the case against you was built on lies. I don't know the full extent of the conspiracy that put you behind bars, but we're going to find out. The truth is out there, John, and I'm bringing everything I have to make sure it comes to light. I'll be in touch with you soon. Keep your head up. You're not alone in this anymore." Elon Musk. John read the letter 3 times before he could even process the words. His first instinct was disbelief. But then, as the realization sank in, something else happened. A rush of adrenaline flooded through his veins. This was it. They were really doing this. The fight for his freedom had begun in earnest. For the first time in 7 years, John felt a renewed sense of purpose. The days in prison, which had once felt endless, began to blur into one another as he focused solely on preparing for what was to come. The letters from Elon continued to arrive, each one providing more information about the legal strategy, the evidence they were uncovering, and the steps they were taking to dismantle the case against him. But even with this new hope, John couldn't ignore the reality of his situation. He was still in prison. He still had to face the daily grind of life behind bars, where every moment felt like a constant struggle to survive. The guards were still watching him. The other prisoners still saw him as just another inmate. Nothing had really changed, except for the fact that someone on the outside was fighting for him. As the weeks passed, John found himself struggling with the emotional weight of it all. He had been so consumed by the idea of clearing his name, of getting out, that he had almost forgotten what it felt like to have hope, to have a future. But now, as he paced the narrow confines of his cell, he realized something. This was the beginning of something bigger than himself. It wasn't just about getting out of prison. It was about fighting for justice, for truth, and for everything he had lost. One evening, as John sat in the small common area of the prison, one of the guards walked by, giving him an odd look. John could tell something was off. There was a tension in the air, a sense of foreboding. He didn't know what it meant yet, but he could feel it. Something was changing. The following morning, as the prison doors slammed shut behind him, John received a surprise visit. His lawyer, a woman named Rachel, walked through the visiting room with a serious look on her face. She was tall, with sharp features and an intensity in her eyes that told John she wasn't someone who gave up easily. She had become his primary contact with Elon's team, and John had come to trust her more than anyone in recent weeks. "John," Rachel said, pulling out a folder of papers from her bag. "We've got something. Something big." John's heart raced. He leaned forward, eager to hear what she had to say. "We've managed to track down the original prosecutor who handled your case. It turns out, she's been involved in a few questionable actions recently. We're putting together a case to expose her. If we can tie her to the corruption that led to your conviction, it's going to be the key to everything." John's mind whirled. The idea that the prosecutor, someone who had played a key role in putting him behind bars, was involved in corruption was a breakthrough he hadn't expected. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice low. Rachel nodded. "We've got solid evidence. The tide is turning, John. But this is just the beginning. We need you to stay focused. We're getting closer." As she left the visiting room, John sat back in his chair, his mind racing. This was it. the first crack in the wall that had kept him locked away for so long. The fight had begun, but there was still much more to do. And with each new piece of evidence, John felt something else stir inside him, the courage to face whatever came next. The weeks following Rachel's visit were a blur for John. The news that they had evidence against the prosecutor who had put him behind bars was both exhilarating and overwhelming. It was the first real sign that he might be able to prove his innocence, that he might finally have a chance to escape the prison he had called home for so long. But with that hope came an avalanche of fear. What if they were wrong? What if this was just another cruel twist of fate? John couldn't stop thinking about it, couldn't stop wondering if this time, the truth would really be enough to set him free. The more he thought about it, the more the weight of everything. The years lost, the family he could never get back, the life that had been stolen from him, crushed him. But then there was Elon. The hope Elon had given him. Every time John felt like he might break, he thought of the man who had offered him a lifeline. Elon didn't have to care about him. He didn't have to get involved in this fight. But he did. And that gave John a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt in years. That night, after another long day of trying to make sense of the paperwork Rachel had left him, John sat in his cell, staring out the tiny window at the night sky. It was a clear night. There wasn't a cloud in sight, and the stars twinkled like distant promises. For the first time in a long time, John allowed himself to believe in something again. He believed that he might actually get out. He believed that the truth might finally win. But it wasn't just about the fight for freedom anymore. It was about redemption, about proving to the world, and to himself, that he was more than the lies that had defined him for so long. It was about showing his daughter, Emily, that her father was innocent, that the man she had once loved hadn't turned into the criminal the world had painted him as. John closed his eyes, allowing himself a rare moment of peace. The last few years had been filled with nothing but pain and bitterness. But tonight, he felt something different, a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he was finally on the right path. The next day, the phone call came. Rachel had news. "John, you need to get ready," she said, her voice crackling with excitement through the receiver. "We're going to move on the prosecutor. We've gathered enough evidence to take this to the authorities. We're filing a motion for your case to be reopened." John's heart raced. The time had finally come. The waiting, the uncertainty, the dread. It was all about to end. His mind spun with questions. Would this really work? Would the truth finally come to light? "There's more," Rachel continued. "We've also uncovered a connection between the prosecutor and some of the officers involved in your case. They're involved in a larger scandal, one that could bring down not just the people who framed you, but an entire network of corruption within the department. If we can expose this, it's not just about your case, it's about changing the system." John sat back in his chair, a rush of emotions flooding over him. This was it. This was the breakthrough he had been waiting for. But with it came a new kind of fear. The people who had wronged him were powerful. They had the resources to make things go away. What if they tried to stop him? What if this all fell apart? "You'll be safe, John," Rachel assured him, sensing his hesitation. "We've got the resources we need. Elon's backing us all the way. We're going to expose everything." The words rang in his ears, but they couldn't quiet the storm of uncertainty raging inside him. Nothing in his life had ever come easily. He had been pushed down, beaten up, and betrayed more times than he could count. And now, as the walls of his cell seemed to close in around him, he realized something. The fight wasn't just for his freedom. It was for the truth, for justice, and for his soul. Over the next few days, things began to move quickly. Rachel and her team worked tirelessly, filing motions, gathering evidence, and preparing for the legal battle of a lifetime. John's mind raced as he tried to keep up. For the first time in years, he felt like he had control over something, anything. He wasn't powerless anymore. But with every step forward, the danger grew. There were whispers in the halls of the prison, guards who seemed to know too much. John couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him, someone who didn't want the truth to come out. It was a chilling thought, but John knew he couldn't back down now. He had come too far. There was no turning back. The moment of truth arrived on a Wednesday afternoon. John was called into the visiting room, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea what was about to happen, but he knew it was a pivotal moment. When he walked in, he saw Rachel sitting at the table with a man John didn't recognize, a lawyer with sharp features and an air of confidence that could only come from someone who had seen it all. "John, this is Mark Reynolds," Rachel said, introducing him. "He's one of the best criminal defense lawyers in the country, and he's here to help you." Mark gave John a firm handshake. "I've been following your case," he said, his voice low but clear. "We've got enough evidence to not only clear your name, but to bring down the entire corrupt network that's been running things behind the scenes. You're not just fighting for yourself anymore, John. You're fighting for everyone who's been wronged by the system." John nodded, feeling the weight of those words settle deep inside him. For years, he had been fighting for his own survival. But now, he realized, the stakes were higher. This wasn't just about him. It was about every person who had ever been unjustly accused, every person who had ever been betrayed by the system meant to protect them. Mark's next words hit John like a thunderclap. "We're going to expose everything. And when we do, everything changes. The world won't look the same." The next few weeks passed in a blur of legal proceedings and investigative breakthroughs. As much as John wanted to focus on the progress being made, every part of him was still consumed by the battle ahead. The deeper they dug into his case, the more they uncovered, and it was like a house of cards beginning to collapse. For John, the wait was agonizing. Each passing day brought a new set of documents to review, new meetings with lawyers, and countless hours spent thinking about the life he had left behind. He thought of his daughter, Emily, of the moments he had lost, of the hope he had once felt, before the lies, before the world turned its back on him. The thought of seeing her again kept him going through the darkest times. Through it all, Elon Musk remained a constant presence. Though their communication was more sporadic now, the billionaire had ensured that every resource he had was being poured into John's case. Private investigators were digging through records, forensic experts were examining evidence, and there were even teams working to expose the corruption within the police department that had framed him. It was surreal for John. A part of him still couldn't fully believe that someone like Elon Musk, who had the world at his fingertips, cared enough to put everything on the line for his case. It felt like a dream, one he was too afraid to wake up from. But as each day passed, the momentum built. The legal team had gathered enough evidence to push for an official reopening of John's case, and they were preparing to present it to the court. It was a moment of truth. Everything they had worked for would either fall into place, or it would all come crashing down. And then, the call came. John was summoned to the prison's visitation room once again. This time, he felt a sense of anticipation in the air, as though the moment was finally here. As he entered the room, he saw Rachel and Mark sitting at the table. There was a familiar urgency in their faces. This was it. "John," Rachel said as he sat down, "we've done it. The case is officially being reopened." John's heart skipped a beat. He had waited so long to hear those words, and now they were finally real. But there was more. "We've gathered enough evidence to show that the prosecutor and many others involved in your case were part of a corruption ring," Mark said. "They've been covering up their involvement in a series of illegal activities for years. Your case was just one of many where they made sure the guilty went free and the innocent stayed locked up." John leaned back in his chair, trying to process everything. It was more than he had ever imagined. The network of corruption that had kept him locked away for so long was far more extensive than he had ever dreamed. "But there's still more to do," Rachel added. "We're not out of the woods yet. There are still people who will try to stop us, people with a lot of power. We have to be strategic, careful." For the first time in years, John felt a sense of control over his own destiny. The people who had wronged him were finally being exposed. His innocence was no longer a question. It was a matter of fact. It felt like a weight was slowly lifting off his chest, though he knew the final battle was still ahead. The legal proceedings moved quickly after that. The media began to catch wind of the story, and soon the case was plastered across the headlines. The public had already condemned John. Now it was time for them to see the truth. In the courtroom, John sat nervously, his palms sweating as the prosecutors stood up to make their defense. The prosecutor was a woman who had once been celebrated as a rising star in the legal world. But now, her name was being dragged through the mud. her lies exposed for everyone to see. John couldn't help but feel a sense of justice, a sense of vindication, as the case against him unraveled. When the judge finally banged the gavel, the room fell silent. "Mr. MacAllister," the judge said, looking directly at John, "the court has reviewed the evidence in your case and finds that the conviction was, in fact, unjust. You are hereby exonerated of all charges. You are free to go." John felt his breath catch in his chest. The words he had been waiting to hear for so long were finally here. He was free. Free from the prison that had held him for 7 years, free from the lies that had defined him. As the courtroom erupted in applause, John stood up, his legs shaking. He had to fight to keep his emotions in check, but it was impossible. The floodgates opened, and for the first time in years, John allowed himself to feel the weight of the moment. It was a victory, not just for him, but for the truth. The next few days were a whirlwind of media interviews, reporters, and camera flashes. John didn't know how to process it all. His life had been turned upside down in the blink of an eye. But amidst the chaos, there was one moment he had been waiting for. The moment he could finally see his daughter. Emily had been through so much in the past 7 years. She had grown up without her father, believing the lies that had been told about him. But now, John could finally make things right. When Emily stepped into the room to meet him, John's heart swelled with emotion. She was a young woman now, no longer the little girl he remembered, but the love he felt for her had never wavered. "Daddy?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "Is it really you?" John stepped forward, tears in his eyes. He opened his arms, and Emily ran into them. For the first time in years, John held her close, feeling the warmth of her embrace. "I'm so sorry, sweetie," he whispered. His voice choked with emotion. "I'm so sorry for everything, but I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." In that moment, all the pain, all the suffering, all the years of waiting and fighting seemed worth it. He had finally made it back to her. In the weeks that followed, life slowly began to return to some semblance of normalcy. John still had a long way to go. He had to rebuild relationships, reestablish trust, and find a way to move forward in a world that had changed so much during his absence. But one thing was certain. He was no longer the man who had been trapped in a cage of lies. He was free. Free to live, free to love, and free to fight for what was right. As for Elon, John could never fully express how grateful he was for the man who had changed everything. Without him, there was no way John would have ever had a chance. Elon's unwavering support had given him the strength to keep going when everything seemed lost. But now, John's journey was his own. And as he looked toward the future, he knew that the fight for justice was far from over. His case was just one of many. And as long as he had breath in his lungs, he would keep fighting for himself, for Emily, and for everyone who had ever been wronged by the system. John's newfound freedom was still sinking in. The world outside the prison walls seemed both familiar and foreign. The cars, the noise, the rush of people. It was all overwhelming. He had spent 7 years in a place where time barely moved, where every day felt like a repeat of the last. But now, every step outside felt like a new beginning. The air smelled different, the colors seemed brighter, and the weight on his shoulders, though still present, was lighter than it had ever been. Yet, there were still moments where John couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped. Old habits from his time in prison came back to him, constantly checking over his shoulder, being hyper-aware of his surroundings, always feeling like he was being watched. It would take time to shake off the paranoia, to learn how to live in the world again without the constant sense of impending danger. His first few days outside were filled with mundane but necessary tasks. Setting up a new apartment, meeting with Rachel to discuss the next steps, and dealing with a flood of media requests. But amidst all the noise, John couldn't help but think of Emily and the future they could finally have together. One evening, as John sat in the modest apartment that had been arranged for him, he picked up his phone and dialed a number he had been putting off. It was time. "Hey, it's me," John said when the call connected. "Dad?" Emily's voice came through, hesitant at first, as though unsure of what to expect. "Yeah, it's me. I wanted to say thank you for everything. I know it's been a lot, But Dad, stop, Emily interrupted. I'm just happy you're out. We can figure everything else out, okay? You don't have to keep saying sorry. John smiled at her words, but they stung a little. It was a reminder of all the time he had missed, time that he would never get back. I just wanted you to know that I'm here. I'm not going anywhere again. I'm going to make up for everything. I promise you that. The silence on the other end of the line was thick with emotion. Finally, Emily spoke again. I know, Dad. I know. It was a simple exchange, but it meant the world to John. The years of distance between them, the years of lies, couldn't be erased in a single conversation. But it was a start, a glimmer of hope for a future where they could rebuild their relationship piece by piece. As John worked through the logistics of his new life, he began to think about the next chapter, about what he wanted to do with the freedom he had fought so hard for. The world had changed so much in the years he had been locked away. Technology had advanced, society had shifted, and he felt like a stranger in a place he should have known. Rachel was still by his side, helping him navigate the complex landscape of his new reality. She had become not only his lawyer but also a friend, someone who believed in him when no one else did. Together, they discussed the possibility of taking legal action against the department and the prosecutor who had wrongfully convicted him. But there was also the question of his own healing, of how he could move forward without being constantly tied to the past. You know, John, Rachel said one evening as they sat in a cafe, you could do a lot of good for others who've been through what you've been through. Your story could inspire so many people. John looked at her, considering her words. You're saying I should turn this into a cause? Exactly. You've been wronged. But now you have a chance to be part of something bigger. Maybe it's time to change the system, help those who are still suffering. You could use your story, your voice. You have the platform now. The idea took root in John's mind. Maybe she was right. Maybe the best way to make sure the fight wasn't just about him was to help others who were still trapped in a system that didn't care about justice. I'll think about it, John said, not sure yet if he was ready to step into the public eye again. But the seed had been planted, and he couldn't ignore the possibility that this was the next step in his journey, fighting not just for his freedom, but for the freedom of others. Days turned into weeks, and John's life began to take shape. He started volunteering at a local organization that worked with individuals who had been wrongfully convicted, helping them navigate the legal system and offering his own experiences as a source of strength. He also became involved in speaking out about prison reform, advocating for those who had no voice and no one to fight for them. But there was still the matter of Elon Musk. Despite everything that had happened, John couldn't forget the man who had believed in him when no one else did. The support Elon had given him had been invaluable, financially, emotionally, and in every way imaginable. John had a deep sense of gratitude toward Elon, but he also knew he needed to take the next step on his own. He needed to figure out how to live without the safety net that Elon's backing had provided. It wasn't that he wanted to distance himself from Elon. Far from it. But John knew that the real work now was his own. He couldn't rely on anyone else to fix his life. He had to be the one to build it back, piece by piece, just like he had rebuilt his relationship with Emily. One day, after a long meeting at the organization, John found himself standing outside in the crisp evening air, thinking about everything he had been through. The road ahead was still uncertain. There were days when the weight of the past felt too heavy, when the memories of the prison and the people who had betrayed him haunted him. But there were also moments of clarity, moments when he felt like he was finally on the right path. Later that night, John sat at his small kitchen table, staring at a photo of his daughter. The photo was old, taken back when things were simpler, when he was still a cop and life seemed predictable. He remembered the way Emily used to laugh when they played together, the way she clung to him like he was the only one who could keep her safe. I'm going to make things right, Em, he whispered to the photo, a promise he had made to himself 1,000 times. I won't let the past define me anymore. I'll be the man you deserve. And for the first time since his release, John believed it. As the days stretched into weeks, John's life gradually regained some semblance of normalcy, but an undercurrent of unease never quite left him. While he found solace in his work with the organization, helping others who had been wrongfully convicted like him, a nagging feeling persisted. a sense that the world had shifted in ways he hadn't yet fully grasped. He was rebuilding, but there were moments when the weight of everything, the years lost, the years of grief, and the lost trust in the system, would overwhelm him. No matter how many victories he celebrated, those shadows never fully lifted. And then, as if the universe wanted to remind him that his story was still far from over, a phone call came that would change everything. It was early on a quiet Tuesday morning, the kind of day where everything feels like it's in its right place. John was sitting in his living room, sipping his coffee and reading the news on his tablet. He'd gotten into the habit of catching up on current events, something he had missed while in prison, but this time, something caught his eye that made his heart skip a beat. The headline screamed across the screen, "Ex-cop who was wrongfully convicted to meet with Elon Musk in historic charity event." His fingers hovered over the screen as he read the article. It seemed that the man who had helped him so much, the one who had fought on his behalf, was now planning a major public event to raise awareness about wrongful convictions and prison reform. The event was set to take place in just a few weeks, and Elon Musk was scheduled to appear to discuss the future of criminal justice reform. But there was something about it that didn't sit right with John. The article also mentioned that some of the victims of wrongful convictions, like himself, would be attending as special guests. As much as John appreciated the idea of raising awareness, he couldn't help but wonder, was this just another publicity stunt? Was Elon doing this for the right reasons? Or was he simply using people like John to improve his own image? It wasn't that John didn't appreciate Elon's help, far from it. But this felt different. Something about the way it was being framed, the way it was being presented, made him feel uneasy. And before he had a chance to process his emotions fully, his phone rang. "Hello?" John answered, his voice steady, though his heart was racing. "John, it's Rachel," came the voice on the other end. "We need to talk. This event, Elon Musk's charity event, it's a big deal. They want you to be part of it." John frowned. "What do you mean, part of it?" "I mean, they want you to be one of the key speakers. They want you to share your story in front of a massive audience. It's a huge opportunity, but..." Rachel's voice trailed off. "But what?" John asked, sensing the hesitation. Rachel took a deep breath. "But you need to know the truth. There's more to this than just a charity event. Elon Musk is more involved in this movement than you think, perhaps more than he's letting on. Some people are questioning his motives. They believe it might not be entirely altruistic." John's stomach tightened. This wasn't just about prison reform anymore. He was about to step into a spotlight that was much brighter and potentially much more dangerous than he'd anticipated. "I need to think about it," John replied, his voice quiet. "I don't know if I'm ready for something like this." "I get it," Rachel said, "but you need to make a decision soon. This is a major step forward for you, for the cause. You have a chance to speak out in a way that few people ever get. But you also need to be cautious. This might come with a price." John spent the next few days grappling with the idea of attending the event. He talked it over with Emily, who had always been his sounding board, and she was supportive but cautious. "You've come so far, Dad. But if you decide to do this, just make sure you're doing it for the right reasons. You can't let anyone use you," Emily said. Her words carried weight. She understood the danger of being exploited more than anyone else. Rachel also weighed in, advising him to be strategic. "You have a chance to make a real impact. Just make sure you're not being used as a pawn in someone else's game." But despite the support and the advice, John was conflicted. Was he really ready for this? Could he trust Elon? Or was he simply another cog in a machine he couldn't control? The night before the event, John sat alone in his apartment, watching the stars through the window. The quiet of the evening seemed to mock him. He had faced countless challenges in his life: years in prison, the loss of his reputation, the fractured relationship with his daughter, and now, just when he thought he could finally breathe, he was being asked to take another leap of faith. Was this the right decision? Was he just looking for validation? Or was this truly a chance to change things for the better? As he sat there, lost in his thoughts, there was a knock on the door. His heart skipped. He hadn't been expecting anyone. When he opened it, he was stunned to see a familiar face standing there. "Elon Musk." "Elon," John said, unable to hide his surprise. "What are you doing here?" Elon stepped inside, looking as calm and composed as ever. "I wanted to talk to you, John, in person, about everything." John couldn't hide his skepticism. "You've done so much already. What's left to say?" Elon paused for a moment, then sat down on the couch, gesturing for John to join him. "I'm not here to make this about me, but I need you to understand something. This event, this whole movement, it's bigger than just raising awareness. We have a chance to change the way the system works, to fix something that's been broken for decades. And I need people like you, John. People who know what it's like, people who've been through the fire." John sat down, still unsure where Elon was going with this. "I've been fighting for reform for years, but I can't do it alone. You're the face of this now. Your story is powerful, and people will listen. But more than that, you have a platform now. You have a chance to make a real difference." John stared at him, feeling a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. Was this real? Or was Elon just another man with a cause to push, using John's pain to fuel it? "Think about it, John. This isn't just about us. It's about everyone who's still trapped in that system. We can't waste this opportunity." The weight of Elon's words hung in the air. For the first time, John saw the bigger picture. It wasn't just about him, and it wasn't just about the public image of one billionaire. This was about changing the system, giving a voice to the voiceless. But was he ready to be that voice? The days leading up to the charity event felt like a whirlwind. John barely had time to process everything as he tried to prepare himself for the most public appearance of his life. Every moment was filled with doubt and a growing sense of unease. Would his decision be the right one? Was he making a mistake? John couldn't stop thinking about that conversation with Elon Musk. The sincerity in Elon's eyes had unsettled him. For the first time, John saw something different in the billionaire, someone who genuinely believed in the cause. But was that enough for John to trust him? As the night of the event grew closer, John found himself pulled between two forces. On one hand, he knew that he had a platform now, a chance to speak to the masses, to share his story, to shine a light on the injustices that had plagued not just him but thousands of others. On the other hand, the fear of being exploited, of becoming a pawn in someone else's game, continued to haunt him. On the morning of the event, John woke up early, his mind racing. He stood in front of the mirror, staring at his reflection, as if trying to find the man he once was. The man who had been a cop, who had been driven by justice, who had believed in the system. That man was gone. The years of wrongful imprisonment had changed him, had shown him that the system he had once sworn to protect was deeply flawed. And yet, here he was, about to stand in front of thousands, perhaps millions, to expose that very system. "Do I really want this?" he muttered to himself, rubbing his face. His heart was heavy with uncertainty, but deep down, he knew there was no going back now. If he wanted to make a real difference, if he wanted to change the world for the better, this was the only way. He was ready to fight, not just for himself, but for every person who had ever been wrongfully convicted. This wasn't just about redemption. It was about justice, real justice. At the venue, the energy was electric. The grand ballroom was filled with hundreds of people, celebrities, activists, politicians, and members of the press. The stage was set, the lights blindingly bright, and the audience was eagerly awaiting the speeches that would kick off the event. John's nerves were a live wire, but there was no turning back now. Elon was already there, speaking with some of the key sponsors. He smiled at John as he approached, offering a handshake. "You ready for this?" Elon asked, his voice calm, almost soothing in the midst of all the chaos. John hesitated, then nodded. "I think so, but it feels like too much, you know? Too many eyes on me." Elon gave a small, understanding smile. "You don't have to do this alone. We're in this together." That was the thing about Elon. No matter how many public appearances he made or how grandiose his ventures were, there was always a sense of humanity to him that John hadn't expected. Elon wasn't just the tech mogul everyone read about in the news. He was someone who understood the value of human connection. And that, more than anything, was what made John feel like maybe he wasn't alone in this fight. But still, the stage loomed ahead. The event wasn't just about Elon. It was about people like John, the ones whose lives had been torn apart by a system that had failed them. And now, they were all there, gathered together, trying to make sure no one else would suffer the same fate. John was called to the stage. His heart raced in his chest as the spotlight hit him. He walked forward, his legs a bit shaky, but with each step, the weight of the moment seemed to settle. The roar of the audience faded as he reached the podium. There was a brief moment of silence, and then he began. "I'm not here because I'm a hero," he started, his voice steady but raw. "I'm here because I was a victim of a broken system. A system that I swore to uphold. A system that betrayed me, and many others like me." John paused for a moment, collecting himself. The crowd was hanging on his every word. 7 years. 7 years of my life were stolen from me. And for what? A crime I didn't commit. A crime that I was framed for. And that's just the beginning of the story. There are thousands of people out there who are still in prison for crimes they didn't commit. They're forgotten, ignored, or worse, taken advantage of by a system that's supposed to protect them. His words rang out in the large hall, and John could feel the shift. The audience wasn't just listening. They were absorbing every word. The weight of his pain, of his experiences, was being shared with them. "This fight isn't just mine," John continued. "This fight is for everyone who's been wronged, for everyone who's been lied to, for everyone who's lost their freedom because of corruption and incompetence. We can't let this continue. We can't keep ignoring the truth." As he spoke, John could see Elon off to the side, his eyes focused on him, listening intently. For a brief moment, their gazes met, and John felt something pass between them. Maybe this was the beginning of something real, something that could make a difference. The speech was over in a blur. The applause was deafening, and for the first time in a long while, John allowed himself to feel proud of what he had done. He hadn't just shared his story. He had shared the story of countless others who had been wrongfully convicted, who had been failed by a system that was supposed to protect them. But as John stepped off the stage, something unexpected happened. A man, who had been sitting in the front row, stood up, his face filled with rage. He began shouting, loud, incomprehensible words, and it didn't take long before security rushed over to subdue him. John's heart skipped a beat. Was this man angry with him? Or was there something deeper at play? He didn't know, but one thing was clear. His decision to step into the spotlight wasn't going to be without consequences. Later that evening, John found himself sitting in a quiet corner of the venue, trying to collect his thoughts. The chaos of the event had died down, but his mind was still racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get even more complicated. Rachel had warned him. She had told him that this moment would be pivotal, not just for him, but for the cause. And while John had done what he needed to do, he couldn't help but feel that the real battle was only just beginning. Was he ready for the consequences of speaking out? Was he ready to handle whatever came next? He wasn't sure. But as he looked at the crowd, the faces of people who had listened to him, who had been moved by his words, he realized that he didn't have a choice. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had suffered the same fate. And whatever came next, he was ready to fight. John had never imagined that speaking out would change so much so quickly. The aftermath of his speech at Elon Musk's charity event was nothing short of overwhelming. The news outlets ran with his story, and before he knew it, he was in the center of a media storm. Headlines praised him as a hero, a voice for the voiceless, someone who had emerged from the ashes of a broken system to fight for the wrongfully convicted. But with the praise came something darker. For every article that celebrated his courage, there was another that questioned his motives. Was he a pawn in Elon Musk's game, an opportunistic figurehead for a billionaire's personal brand? Were his words truly his own, or had he been manipulated into taking center stage for a cause much bigger than himself? John couldn't escape the noise. He spent sleepless nights reading articles, watching the debates unfold on TV, and checking the constant stream of social media posts about him. Some called him brave, others called him naive. The comments were endless, and as he scrolled through them, he couldn't help but feel like the whole world was waiting for him to fail. One morning, John sat at his kitchen table, sipping his coffee and staring at the newspaper in front of him. A headline caught his eye. Is Elon Musk using John Bradley's story for his own gain? John felt his chest tighten. He had expected some pushback, but this felt different. The article wasn't just questioning his role, it was questioning his integrity. And worse, it seemed to suggest that John was being manipulated by forces far greater than him. The article went on to quote unnamed sources who claimed that Elon was using the wrongful conviction movement to further his own corporate agenda, and that John was simply the face of a larger plan. John ran a hand through his hair, frustration building. He'd been through hell and back, and now, just as he was trying to do some good, people were questioning him. Later that afternoon, Rachel called. Her voice was calm but serious. "John, you need to be careful. I've been hearing things, and the press is starting to turn on you. There's a narrative out there now that you're being used. People are starting to question your motivations." John sighed deeply. "I don't know what to think anymore. I'm just trying to make a difference. Why can't they see that?" "Because," Rachel said gently, "the truth doesn't always sell. And right now, you're caught between two powerful forces: Elon's public persona and the cause you're fighting for. The media loves a good story, but they're not interested in the nuances. They want villains and heroes, not the complicated truths of real life." John leaned back in his chair, the weight of the conversation pressing on him. "So, what do I do?" "I think you need to take control of your narrative," Rachel replied. "People respect you for your honesty, for your willingness to stand up. But you need to show them that this fight is about more than just one person or one billionaire. It's about justice. It's about changing the system. And you need to be clear about that." The next few days were a blur as John worked with his team to figure out how to handle the growing media storm. It was clear that the event had sparked something much larger than he had anticipated. The coverage was intense, and though some of it was positive, there was a rising tide of skepticism surrounding Elon's involvement and John's role in the movement. Elon reached out to John, asking for a private meeting. It was a request that both intrigued and unnerved him. Was this about business, or was it personal? After all, John had just aired his doubts publicly. Perhaps this was his chance to clear the air. John agreed, and they met at one of Elon's private offices, a sleek, modern space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Elon greeted him warmly, but John could sense a layer of tension beneath the surface. "You've been in the spotlight for a while now," Elon said, offering John a seat. "I know it's not easy. The media can be brutal, and there are always people who will try to tear down what you're trying to build." John sat down, his mind racing. "I didn't sign up for all of this. I thought we were fighting for the wrongfully convicted, not for headlines." Elon nodded, his expression serious. "I understand, and I don't want to undermine what you're doing. But the reality is, when you're working on something this big, it's impossible to keep the personal and the political separate. The movement needs attention, needs a face. I thought that you were the right person for that." John didn't answer right away. He stared at Elon, the weight of the conversation pressing on him. "So, you're telling me that I'm just the face of your cause?" "No," Elon replied, his voice calm but firm. "I'm telling you that you have a chance to make a difference. And the press? They're not going to make it easy for either of us. But that doesn't mean you should stop. In fact, it means you need to double down." John was quiet for a moment, digesting Elon's words. It wasn't that he didn't believe in the cause, he did. But the more he listened to Elon, the more he wondered if this was about something larger than what he had originally signed up for. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," John finally admitted. "The media, the pressure, it's all too much. I don't want to be a puppet in your game, Elon. I want to make a real change." "I understand," Elon said, his tone softening. "But making a real change takes sacrifice. You're not just fighting for yourself anymore. You're fighting for everyone who's ever been wrongfully convicted. And that's not something that's going to happen overnight. People will try to tear you down, but you have to be ready for that." John felt his heart race. The weight of Elon's words echoed in his mind. Was he truly ready for the fight ahead? Was he prepared to stand alone, with everyone watching? That night, as John lay in bed, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the edge of something huge. His life had already been shattered by the injustices he had faced, but now, it seemed that the world was expecting him to play a role far beyond anything he had imagined. The media, the pressure, and the internal struggle, it was all taking its toll. But deep down, John knew there was no turning back. He had come too far to let the system win again. And though the storm was far from over, he wasn't ready to back down. Not now. Not ever. John felt the weight of the world pressing against him, and it seemed as though every day brought with it a new wave of challenges. The media storm had grown to a deafening roar, and the attention that had once felt like validation now felt like a relentless scrutiny. He couldn't go anywhere without being recognized. People wanted pictures, interviews, and answers. They wanted him to be a symbol of something bigger, something that he wasn't sure he could fully embrace. His phone buzzed incessantly with messages from reporters, activists, and even former colleagues who had reached out with their own thoughts, their own opinions. It was clear that he was being pulled in 100 different directions, and no matter how hard he tried to focus on the cause, the distractions felt like they were piling up around him. He had become a brand, a movement, a focal point for everything that was wrong with the justice system, but in the back of his mind, John couldn't help but question whether this was the fight he had signed up for. Rachel called him again, her voice urgent. "John, you need to see this." John had been at home, pacing around the living room, unable to sit still for more than a few minutes. The tension in his chest had been building for days, and Rachel's tone made it clear that whatever news she had was going to add more fuel to the fire. "What is it?" he asked, rubbing his temples. "It's about the rally. The one Elon's organizing next week," she replied. "There's a whole new level of controversy surrounding it. There are rumors that some high-ranking politicians are backing it for their own gain. It's not just about wrongful convictions anymore. People are seeing it as a political spectacle." John felt his stomach drop. He had hoped that this movement, this cause, could remain pure, focused on the issues that truly mattered. But the closer he got to the center of it, the more he realized that this wasn't just about justice. It was about power, influence, and agendas far beyond anything he had ever imagined. "Are you saying Elon is involved in this?" John asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "I don't know if he's directly involved, but he's definitely tied to it now. And there are whispers that some of the biggest donors are looking to use this as a way to push their own political agendas. This could get really ugly, John." John sank into the couch, trying to wrap his mind around the chaos that seemed to be spiraling out of control. The very thing he had hoped would bring change, a movement to fight for the wrongfully convicted, was becoming more complicated and dangerous by the day. The following week, John attended the rally with a growing sense of dread in his chest. The event was meant to bring awareness to the issues he cared so deeply about, but the atmosphere was charged with something he hadn't expected. The crowds were large, but there was a palpable undercurrent of political tension in the air. People were shouting not just for justice, but for power, for control. John found himself on stage, looking out at the sea of faces, many of whom were holding signs and chanting slogans that seemed to blur the line between justice and political warfare. Some of the signs had the faces of politicians John didn't even recognize, and the speeches leading up to his moment were filled with political rhetoric that didn't sit right with him. Elon was backstage, surrounded by his team, but John could feel the distance between them. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional. He had been part of this cause, but now it felt like he was an outsider, watching something he had hoped would be pure become something else entirely. The stage lights blazed in his eyes as he stepped forward to speak. His heart pounded in his chest. He had a choice now. He could either play the part they wanted him to play, or he could speak the truth, no matter the cost. He grabbed the microphone, his hand shaking slightly, and the crowd quieted. "I came here today because I believed in something," he started, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "I believed in justice. I believed that we could fix the broken system that took so much from me, and from so many others. But what I see now, it's not just about justice anymore. It's about power. It's about influence." The audience was silent, hanging on his every word. He could feel the shift in the air as people began to realize that this wasn't the speech they were expecting. "I've spent years in prison for a crime I didn't commit," he continued, his voice growing stronger. "And I've seen what happens when the system fails. But what I'm seeing now is that this movement, this cause, is being hijacked by forces that don't care about justice. They care about control." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some were nodding, others were visibly shocked. John's words were ringing true for many, But there were others, those who had hoped to turn the rally into something more political, who were beginning to look uncomfortable. Elon and I, John went on, we started this because we wanted to make a difference. But I'm not here to be a pawn in anyone's game. I'm here because I believe in justice. I'm here because I believe that no one should go through what I went through. But if this cause becomes about anything other than that, if it becomes about politics or power or anything other than fighting for the innocent, then I will walk away. He paused, letting his words sink in. He could see the reporters in the crowd, their cameras focused on him, ready to capture every moment of this turn in the narrative. The tension was thick, and for a brief moment, it felt as though everything had come to a standstill. I don't need this, John added quietly, but the people who are still suffering in prison for crimes they didn't commit do. That's why we're here. That's what we need to focus on. Nothing more, nothing less. As John finished speaking, the crowd erupted into applause. It wasn't unanimous. Some cheered, others booed, and a few were shouting their own political slogans. But for the first time since he'd stepped onto that stage, John felt like he had taken control of his own narrative. He wasn't a pawn. He wasn't a figurehead. He was just a man fighting for what was right. Later that evening, Elon approached him backstage. The tension between them was palpable, but Elon's expression was unreadable. That wasn't what we discussed, Elon said quietly, his tone sharp. John didn't flinch. I'm not going to be part of something I don't believe in, Elon. This started as a fight for justice, and I'm not going to let it become a political stunt. Elon's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. Instead, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the chaos of the rally. John stood there for a moment, watching him go, wondering if this was the end of their partnership or the beginning of something new. That night, as John lay in bed, he stared at the ceiling, his thoughts racing. Had he just made a huge mistake? Had he alienated the very people who could help him push the cause forward? Or had he done the right thing, even if it meant standing alone? There was no way to know for sure. But one thing was clear. He couldn't back down now. The fight for justice wasn't about the people who wanted to control the narrative. It was about the ones who had been forgotten by the system. And John was ready to make sure they were no longer ignored. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. Do you think John made the right choice? Is this movement truly about justice, or is it being used for something else? John's words at the rally echoed in his mind long after he had walked off the stage. The applause, the murmurs of dissent, it was all still ringing in his ears. He had no idea what the fallout would be, but he was certain of one thing. His path had just taken a new direction. The fight for justice was no longer a simple cause. It had become a battleground for something much bigger. Elon hadn't reached out to him after the rally, which only deepened the tension between them. Their partnership, once a beacon of hope for the wrongfully convicted, now seemed fragile, teetering on the edge of collapse. John couldn't help but wonder if he had burned too many bridges with his impromptu speech. Had he alienated the very people who had the resources to help him make a real difference? Or had he done the right thing in speaking out? The media frenzy continued unabated. While some outlets praised John for his courage, others were more cynical. The headlines shifted from his wrongful conviction to questions about his loyalty to Elon Musk's vision. The press portrayed him as a wild card, a man who could no longer be controlled, and that made him a threat. The next few days were a blur. John spent most of his time meeting with lawyers, activists, and reporters. Everyone wanted a piece of him. Some sought to use him for their own agendas, while others simply wanted to hear his side of the story. But amidst the whirlwind, John couldn't shake the feeling that he was being pulled in every direction, by people who claimed to have his best interests at heart, but who were ultimately more concerned with their own power. One evening, as he sat in his apartment alone, a knock on the door broke the silence. John opened it to find a familiar face, Rachel, holding a bag of takeout food. She gave him a tired smile. "Thought you could use some company," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. John returned her smile weakly. "You're right. I could definitely use a break from all of this." They sat down at the kitchen table, the food between them untouched. John stared at it, but his mind was elsewhere. His thoughts were still spinning from the rally, from Elon, and from the endless media coverage. Rachel took a deep breath and set her fork down. I've been thinking a lot about what you said at the rally. And I get it, John. I do. You've made your stance clear, and it's brave. But I think you need to understand that you're in a position now where you can't just walk away from all this. You've already spoken out, and people are looking to you for leadership. John rubbed his face, exhaustion weighing heavily on him. I didn't sign up for leadership. I signed up to help people who are suffering. This isn't about me. I know, Rachel said, her voice soft, but you've become the face of something much bigger than yourself. Whether you like it or not, people are listening to you. You can either step back and let someone else take control, or you can take charge and steer this in the direction it needs to go. John looked up at her, his eyes weary but resolute. And if I take charge, what happens to me? What happens to my integrity? That's the question, isn't it? Rachel replied. The deeper you get into this, the more you'll realize that it's not just about what's right. It's about navigating the politics, the media, and the people who will try to manipulate this cause for their own benefit. The next morning, John found himself standing in front of a mirror, staring at his reflection. His hair was disheveled, his eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights spent in a haze of media interviews and press conferences. He didn't recognize the man staring back at him anymore. He had started this journey as a man who simply wanted justice, but now he felt like he was in over his head. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was an unfamiliar number. He hesitated before answering. John, it's Elon. The voice on the other end said, We need to talk. John's heart skipped a beat. This was it, the conversation he had been dreading. What would Elon say? Was this the end of their partnership, or the beginning of something even more complicated? I'm listening, John said, trying to keep his voice steady. We can't keep going like this, Elon said, his tone blunt. The rally, the media, it's all getting out of hand. But I think we both know that if we don't stick together, we'll both lose. I can help you, but you have to meet me halfway. John's pulse quickened. Meet you halfway? What does that mean? Elon paused for a moment. It means you have to stop making this personal. You can't keep fighting me. If you want to make a difference, we need to present a united front. The media is already turning this into a spectacle, and if we don't control the narrative, it'll spiral out of our hands. You're better off with me than without me. John clenched his fists, feeling the pressure of Elon's words. He didn't want to give in to the machine that had already begun to shape his life, but he also couldn't ignore the power Elon wielded. He needed resources. He needed support. But at what cost? I don't know if I can do that, John said finally, his voice quiet. I didn't sign up for a fight that's about anything other than justice. If you can't get behind that, then I can't work with you. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I understand, Elon finally said, his voice low. But remember, John, sometimes to make real change, you have to make compromises. John hung up the phone, his mind spinning. What had just happened? Was this the final warning, or was it an opportunity for something more? Later that day, John sat in his apartment, the weight of the conversation with Elon pressing down on him. Rachel had been right. He was at a crossroads. The choice before him wasn't just about his own integrity. It was about whether he could continue the fight for justice without losing himself in the process. There were forces at play, forces he hadn't fully understood when he first started this journey. The media, the politicians, Elon Musk, all of them had their own agendas, and John couldn't help but wonder if he was just another pawn in a game he hadn't signed up for. But he couldn't walk away. Not now. Not when so many lives were at stake. The days following the conversation with Elon were nothing short of a storm. The media circus surrounding John's movement had intensified, and his every move was now under intense scrutiny. It was clear that the once unified cause was beginning to fracture, and John could feel himself slipping further away from the original purpose of the fight. What had begun as a noble pursuit, seeking justice for the wrongfully convicted, was now becoming a personal war, one that seemed to have little to do with the people who had been left behind by the system. John had always prided himself on being someone who fought for what was right, no matter the cost. But as he stared out of his apartment window, watching the city below, he wondered if he had made a mistake. Was he fighting for the cause, Or was he just fighting to hold on to a sense of control in a world that had already spiraled out of his grasp? Rachel had become more of a lifeline than ever before. She had seen the toll the pressure was taking on him, and even though she didn't always agree with his decisions, she had stood by him. Tonight, as she arrived at his apartment with a stack of papers in hand, she looked more concerned than usual. "John, we need to talk," she said, dropping the papers on the coffee table. John sat down across from her, rubbing his eyes, trying to stave off the exhaustion that had become a constant companion. "About what?" "It's about the rally," she said, voice serious. "I've been looking into it. The organization behind it isn't as clean as we thought. There are more strings being pulled behind the scenes, and a lot of the financial backers have their own agendas." John frowned, leaning forward. "What do you mean?" Rachel flipped through the papers she had brought, pulling out a series of reports and documents. "There's a group of influential donors who are using this cause to push their own political agendas. Some are tied to big corporations, others to political parties that want to use your story to further their own influence. I thought we were doing this for the people who've been wrongfully convicted, but it's starting to look like we're just pawns in a much larger game." John's mind raced. He had suspected that there was more going on behind the scenes, but hearing it confirmed made the weight of the situation sink in even deeper. He had tried to distance himself from the politics of the movement, but it was clear now that it wasn't going to be that simple. This was bigger than him, and he had become a key figure in something far more complex than he could have ever imagined. "Do you think Elon knows about this?" John asked, his voice filled with frustration. "I think he might," Rachel said. "Or at least, he's aware that some of these people are involved. But I'm not sure he fully grasps how far-reaching this has become. He's still trying to control the narrative, but this has turned into something that's beyond all of us." John stood up, pacing the room. The realization hit him like a wave. The rally, the movement, it wasn't about the wrongfully convicted anymore. It was about power, and he had become a part of that power struggle. "What do we do now?" he asked, looking at Rachel. Rachel met his gaze with determination. "We do what we've always done. We keep fighting for what's right. But we need to find a way to break free from these forces that are trying to use us. We need to take control of this story and remind people why we started this in the first place." John nodded, feeling the weight of her words. It was true. They couldn't let the cause be hijacked by those with ulterior motives. But how could they do that without risking everything they had fought for? The next day, John reached out to his old lawyer, Daniel, for advice. The two had stayed in touch since John's release, and Daniel had been one of the few people who truly understood the depth of the fight. When John explained what had been happening with the rally and the political maneuvering behind the scenes, Daniel's response was grave. "John, this is exactly why I warned you about getting involved with high-profile figures. When you enter the world of politics, it's hard to keep your hands clean. People will try to use you, and they'll do it in ways you don't even see coming." John sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I didn't think it would come to this. I thought I was just helping people, but now it feels like I've become part of the system I was trying to fight." John's decision loomed larger with every passing moment. As he and Rachel continued to strategize, he felt the weight of responsibility more heavily than ever before. The people who had been wrongfully convicted were counting on him, yet the political and media forces that surrounded him were threatening to overshadow their voices. He had come too far to let it all be taken away, but he couldn't ignore the feeling that he was being pulled in directions he didn't choose. Rachel could sense the growing tension in John. Despite their efforts to distance themselves from the political game, it had become harder to keep their message focused on the truth. Every day, it seemed like the rallying cry for justice was being co-opted by those seeking to use the cause for their own gain. John was determined to take the fight back to its roots, but he needed a plan, and he needed the right people to help him do it. One night, after another exhausting day of media interviews and closed-door meetings, John sat alone in his apartment. His mind was spinning, but there was a sense of clarity creeping in. He knew what needed to be done. It wasn't about grand gestures or flashy rallies anymore. It was about reconnecting with the very people who had inspired him to start this fight in the first place. The families of the wrongfully convicted, the voices that had been silenced for far too long. He grabbed his phone and called Rachel. "We need to go straight to the source," he said when she picked up. It's time we put the focus back where it belongs, on the stories of the people who've been forgotten. No more rallies, no more political speeches. We're going to give these families a platform. Rachel paused, clearly processing the shift in his approach. You mean we'll visit the families of those who are still imprisoned? Talk to the people who've been fighting for justice but have been left behind by the media? Exactly, John replied. It's time to cut through the noise. We'll tell their stories face to face. No more headlines, no more talking points. Just the truth. Rachel's voice softened, but she sounded more resolute than he had heard her in a while. I'm in, but we need to make sure we're doing this for the right reasons. We can't get distracted again. John nodded to himself. We won't. This is where the real fight is. The people who are still behind bars, the families who have been forgotten, they deserve to be heard. The next morning, John and Rachel hit the road. They spent the next several weeks traveling across the country, meeting with families, speaking with advocates, and visiting the prisons where the wrongfully convicted were still serving time. Each story they heard was more heartbreaking than the last. Each person they met was filled with a quiet desperation, a yearning for justice that had been denied for far too long. Daniel paused before speaking again. You have to be careful now. If you're going to continue this fight, you can't let anyone use you as a puppet. You need to take a step back and decide what you really want. This isn't just about being a face for the movement. It's about the long-term goal. What are you in this for? What do you want to achieve? John thought for a moment. The answer was clear, but it felt more complicated now. He didn't just want to be a symbol. He wanted real change. He wanted the people who had been wronged to be heard, to have their voices amplified. But could he still do that while navigating the treacherous waters of politics and media manipulation? I don't want to be part of the spectacle, John said, his voice steady. I want to make sure the people who need help the most are the ones who benefit. If I have to take a step back to do that, then that's what I'll do. Daniel's tone softened. It's not about stepping back. It's about taking control. You've already got the spotlight on you. Now, you just need to make sure you're directing it toward the right things. The days that followed were a blur of strategy sessions, interviews, and internal debates about the future of the movement. John realized that he had to find a way to detach from the political forces that had latched onto his story. He couldn't let himself be a pawn anymore. But that didn't mean he had to walk away. It meant he had to play the game differently, more carefully. Rachel had her own ideas about how to move forward. What if we shifted the focus entirely? What if we started talking more about the individual stories of those who've been wrongfully convicted, instead of making it about the rally or the politicians behind it? If we bring attention to their stories, we'll force people to remember why this fight is so important. John liked the idea, but he knew it wouldn't be easy. The media had already twisted the narrative, and it would take a lot of effort to redirect the conversation. We're going to have to fight even harder now, John said, determination in his voice. But it's worth it. These people deserve better. As the movement's future hung in the balance, John found himself standing at a crossroads. He had to choose whether to continue working with Elon and the political forces that had attached themselves to his cause, or to break free and fight for the real reason he had started this journey, to give a voice to the voiceless and bring justice to the forgotten. In the end, the decision would define not only his legacy but the future of the movement he had helped ignite. John felt something stirring deep within him as he listened to their stories. He had always known that this fight was bigger than him, but the more he saw, the more he understood just how much bigger it was. These were not just legal battles or political issues. They were human lives. Lives that had been broken by a system that had failed them. One afternoon, as they were visiting a small prison in rural Kentucky, John met a woman named Maria. Her son, Diego, had been incarcerated for a crime he didn't commit. Maria had been fighting for years to clear his name, but the system had done everything it could to silence her. She greeted John with a tired smile, but her eyes were filled with an undeniable sadness. As she sat down with them in the visiting room, her hands trembled as she spoke. "I've been trying for so long to get someone to listen to me," Maria said. Her voice choked with emotion. "They told me I was crazy. They told me I was just a mother in denial. But I know my son. I know he didn't do it. He's innocent." John felt the familiar knot form in his stomach. He had heard this before, over and over again. Parents, wives, siblings, all convinced that their loved ones had been wrongly convicted. He looked at Maria and saw the strength in her. She wasn't just a mother in denial. She was a woman who had fought against a system that had refused to acknowledge her truth. "I believe you," John said softly, his voice steady. "We're going to make sure people hear your son's story. He's not going to be forgotten." As the days passed, the weight of the stories they collected began to sink in. John knew that the path ahead wasn't going to be easy. The media and the political machine had their own agenda, and there were powerful forces that didn't want these stories to see the light of day. But John's resolve was hardening. He wasn't in this fight for fame or recognition. He was in it for the people whose voices had been drowned out by the noise. On their last stop before returning to New York, John and Rachel visited a man named Harold, who had been in prison for over 20 years for a crime he had never committed. His case was one of the most egregious miscarriages of justice John had encountered, and yet Harold had never given up hope. As they sat together in a dimly lit prison conference room, Harold's eyes were filled with the kind of quiet anger that only comes from years of being wronged. "I didn't kill her," Harold said, his voice trembling with emotion. "I've been telling them that for years, but they don't care. I'm just a number to them, a mistake that they're too proud to admit." John's heart ached as he listened to Harold's story. This was the reality of the justice system, and it was time for the world to see it. "You're not a mistake," John said, his voice firm. "We're going to make sure they hear you. We're going to make sure they can't ignore your story anymore." As John and Rachel drove back to New York, the weight of their journey pressed heavily on them. They had witnessed firsthand the devastating effects of a broken system, and they knew that the fight ahead would be long and hard. But for the first time in weeks, John felt a sense of purpose that had been missing for far too long. He wasn't just another figurehead in a political game. He was a man fighting for justice, for truth, and for the forgotten. The cause was no longer about him. It was about the people who had been silenced, and he was going to make sure they were heard. John felt like the winds had shifted in his favor, but the road ahead was far from smooth. As he and Rachel returned to New York, they had more than just a handful of stories. They had something far more powerful, a growing network of supporters, activists, and families who had rallied behind their cause. The momentum was slowly building, but the media was still clouded with the chaos of politics and corporate interests. However, there was something undeniably real and raw about the personal stories they had collected. These were not abstract concepts or headlines. They were lives. Real lives that had been shattered by an unjust system. The first signs of change came when they shared one of their visits on social media. The video of Maria, the mother from Kentucky, speaking passionately about her son Diego's wrongful conviction, began to circulate. At first, it was just a few likes and shares, but within hours, it exploded. People were responding with their own stories, families of other wrongfully convicted individuals, and those who had been impacted by the criminal justice system. John saw something in the comments section that made his heart race. "I was there too," one comment read. "My brother is innocent, but no one believes him. Thank you for giving us a voice." The message was simple, but the sentiment echoed through John's soul. This was what it was all about. People needed to feel heard. Rachel, ever the pragmatist, saw the potential immediately. She had always been the one to analyze the situation from every angle, but now, even she could see the change. "We've struck a nerve," she said, pacing in their small office in New York. "It's not just about Diego or Harold or any one individual. It's about the systemic failure, the silent suffering of thousands of innocent people. People are starting to wake up." "I know," John replied, staring at the screen in front of him. "I thought it was going to be a battle to get people to listen, but they're responding in ways I didn't expect. The stories are starting to connect. It's not just about me anymore. It's about all of us." "My son is not just another number in a prison," Maria said, her voice strong despite the emotion. "He is a human being. He is my child, and he deserves to come home. He is innocent, and I will fight until my last breath to make sure everyone knows that." The crowd erupted in applause. It was a moment of raw, unfiltered emotion. It was the reason they were all there. To ensure that these families, these innocent people, were never forgotten. As the rally continued, something shifted in the air. The media, which had initially been skeptical of the event, started to pay attention. Reporters from major news outlets began to approach John, asking questions not about the political maneuvering or corporate sponsorships, but about the stories of the families. The focus was finally back where it belonged, on the people. John stood at the back of the crowd, watching as the event unfolded. He couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. They had done it. They had turned the tide. The movement wasn't just a trend. It was a force that couldn't be ignored. Rachel stood beside him, watching the sea of faces in the crowd. "We're just getting started," she said, a grin spreading across her face. John nodded, his heart swelling with a mixture of hope and resolve. "Yes, we are." As the sun set over the rally, and the last speaker shared their heartfelt plea for justice, John knew that the fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. There was still so much work to do, so many more voices to amplify, so many more stories to be told. But for the first time in a long time, he felt that they were on the right path. This was bigger than just a fight for justice. It was a fight for dignity, for the restoration of humanity. The movement was no longer just about John. It was about everyone who had ever been wronged. And he wasn't going to stop until their voices were heard. Just as momentum was building, and John was beginning to feel that the movement might truly take off, something unexpected happened. A shadow cast over everything he had worked so hard to build. The rally had been a success. There was no denying that. But even as the voices of the wrongfully convicted families were being heard, cracks started to form in their foundation. It started with a phone call. John was sitting in his office, sipping coffee and reviewing the notes from the rally when his phone buzzed. The number was unfamiliar, but something about the urgency in the tone made his heart skip a beat. He answered it, his fingers gripping the edge of the desk. "John," came the voice on the other end. It was Rachel, and her voice sounded strained. "You need to hear this." "But we need more," Rachel continued, tapping the table. "The media will chew us up if we don't take control of the narrative. Right now, they're still pushing their own agendas. It's time we make a move." John nodded slowly, processing the weight of her words. "We need to gather more stories. We need a platform. We need to create a space where these voices can be heard above the noise." Rachel smiled, a knowing glint in her eye. "I've been thinking the same thing. Let's put together a rally. Not the kind where we just stand and shout. We make it about the stories, the people, bring them front and center. Let their voices do the talking." John had always been cautious about rallies. He had seen how easily they could be hijacked by powerful figures, how quickly the message could get lost in the shuffle. But this felt different. If they could spotlight the stories of the wrongfully convicted families, give them a microphone and a stage, they might just have a chance to turn the tide. "We could do it. We'll find the right partners, the right supporters," John said, the vision becoming clearer in his mind. "This is about real change. We're not asking for sympathy. We're asking for justice." In the following days, the two worked tirelessly to coordinate the rally. They reached out to organizations that supported criminal justice reform, worked with legal experts, and began recruiting families who had been touched by the tragedy of wrongful convictions. They used their social media channels to gather support, and soon, the word began to spread like wildfire. As the event drew closer, the reality of what they were trying to achieve settled in. This wasn't just a rally, it was a movement. The spotlight wasn't just on John anymore. It was on the hundreds of voices that had been silenced for too long. On the day of the rally, John stood backstage, feeling the adrenaline build inside him. He was nervous, but not for the reasons he expected. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about the faces in the crowd, the people who had traveled from across the country to have their voices heard. And it was about the families who were still waiting for justice. He knew the eyes of the world would be watching, but for the first time in months, he felt ready. The rally kicked off with a series of emotional speeches. Families of the wrongfully convicted took the stage one by one, sharing their stories with a captivated audience. There were tears, but there was also fire. A collective cry for justice that echoed through the streets. The stories weren't just heartbreaking, they were a call to action. One of the most powerful moments came when Maria, the mother from Kentucky, took the stage. She had been nervous at first, but as soon as she spoke, the crowd fell silent. She shared the pain of losing her son to an unjust system and the years of frustration she had endured trying to get his case heard. Her voice cracked at times, but her message was unwavering. "What's going on?" John asked, suddenly alert. "There's a leak," she said, her words sharp. "Someone on the inside is leaking information to the media. They're spinning everything, making it sound like we're just in this for publicity, using these families for our own gain." John's stomach twisted. He had worked too hard for this to be derailed by something so petty, something that could easily be dismissed as a smear campaign. He didn't have time for this. "Who's behind it?" he demanded. Rachel paused for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "It's hard to say, but it's starting to look like someone close to us. Someone who's been part of this from the start. The media is pushing a narrative that's dangerous, and it's starting to stick." John's mind raced. Betrayal was one thing, but betrayal from within was another. If they were being sabotaged from the inside, it could ruin everything they had worked so hard to build. The media had already begun to report on the supposed scandal. Articles flooded the news outlets claiming that John and Rachel were using the families of the wrongfully convicted as pawns for their own political aspirations. The accusations were subtle but pointed. Questions about their motives, about whether they were truly concerned with justice or whether they were just looking for a platform to boost their own profiles. John's heart sank as he read the headlines. He had known this moment might come, the pressure, the scrutiny, but he had always believed in the integrity of his cause. He had never once thought about the politics, the fame, or the personal gain. All he had wanted was to bring justice to those who had been wronged. But now, it seemed like the narrative was slipping through his fingers. In the following days, tensions inside the movement reached a breaking point. The phone lines were flooded with calls from angry supporters, questioning whether the campaign was truly about justice or if it was just another political stunt. People were beginning to doubt them. Trust, so carefully built, was crumbling. Rachel was at her wits' end, desperately trying to keep everything together, but John could see the strain on her face. She had been his rock through all of this, and now, even she was questioning everything. "This isn't just about us anymore, John," she said one evening as they sat in their office, surrounded by piles of paperwork. "People are losing faith. If we don't figure out who's behind this, and fast, we might lose everything. We can't afford for the movement to fall apart." "I know," John replied, his mind working furiously. "We need to find out who's behind this leak. We need to restore trust, not just in the cause, but in ourselves." Rachel nodded. "I'll start asking around. We have to trust someone, and if we can figure out who's spreading this narrative, maybe we can expose the truth." That night, John couldn't sleep. His mind kept circling back to one thought: betrayal. He had been betrayed before in his career as a cop, but never like this. This was different. This was personal. This wasn't just some shady criminal. It was someone who had been with him every step of the way, someone who had stood beside him at rallies, who had shared his vision. The question gnawed at him. Who could it be? Days passed with no clear answers. But as the media storm intensified, one person stood out to John. Marcus, a longtime friend and ally who had been part of their inner circle since the beginning. Marcus had been with them in the early days, helping them build the movement from the ground up. He had a reputation for being a quiet, trustworthy figure who always kept a level head. But lately, Marcus had been distant. He had started to make comments that didn't quite align with the mission, throwing out doubts about the viability of the cause. He had also been increasingly vocal in private meetings about the politics of it all, insisting that the campaign needed to be more politically palatable to gain real traction. John's suspicions grew with each passing day. Marcus had been one of the first people to suggest that they reach out to more corporate sponsors. At the time, John had been resistant, but now, it felt like a calculated move to shift the narrative. After a particularly tense meeting with a group of legal experts and advocates, John made the decision. He needed to confront Marcus. There was no longer any room for uncertainty. The next morning, John asked Marcus to meet him at a quiet cafe. It was time for answers. When Marcus arrived, he looked as composed as ever, but there was something in his eyes that made John's skin crawl. The conversation started with small talk, but John could tell Marcus was avoiding the real issue. John didn't waste time. "Marcus, I need to ask you something," John said, his voice steady but firm. "There's a leak. I know it's coming from somewhere inside the team. And I have a feeling you know more about it than you're letting on." Marcus froze, his expression momentarily hardening before he quickly masked it with a smile. "John, I have no idea what you're talking about. The media is just doing what they do, trying to spin a story. There's no reason to point fingers." Rachel felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up as she read the message. It was clear now. Marcus was involved. He was the one who had been feeding information to the media. But who was the anonymous source? Who was pulling the strings behind the scenes? John and Rachel met later that day to discuss their findings. As they sat across from each other at the small cafe, the weight of the situation hung heavily between them. "I found it," Rachel said quietly, her voice tinged with frustration. "An email from Marcus. He's been in contact with someone on the outside, someone who's been feeding him information to leak. This isn't just about betrayal anymore, John. It's a coordinated effort." John's stomach twisted. "Who is it? Who's behind this?" "I don't know yet," Rachel said, shaking her head. "But this email, it doesn't just feel like something small. It's not just a personal grudge or someone trying to cause chaos. This feels orchestrated, like they're trying to sabotage everything we've built. But I'm digging. I'll find out who's pulling the strings." John's fists clenched on the table, the frustration boiling in him. He had trusted Marcus, trusted him like a brother. To learn that Marcus was not just complicit, but potentially part of a larger scheme, was a betrayal that hit deeper than any of the ones he had faced in his past. The whole foundation they had built, the lives they had impacted, was being torn apart from within. He couldn't let that happen. The next few days were a blur of frantic calls, research, and piecing together the fragments of information they had. As Rachel worked tirelessly to trace the origins of the email and the hidden connections between Marcus and the anonymous source, John reached out to a few trusted allies. He needed to make sure they had eyes everywhere. The truth wasn't going to just fall into their laps. They had to drag it out. Late one evening, as John was pacing the floor of his small apartment, his phone rang. It was Rachel, her voice low and urgent. "John, I've got something," she said, barely above a whisper. "It's bigger than we thought. I've traced the source. It's someone we know." John's heart raced as he listened intently. "Who?" Rachel paused, as if trying to brace herself for the weight of the name she was about to say. "It's Alan. He's been working with Marcus from the start." John froze, the words hanging in the air like a weight. Alan was a name that struck him deep in his gut. Alan had been one of the earliest supporters of the cause, a well-connected lawyer who had helped them navigate legal roadblocks in the early days. He had always been the picture of professionalism, a staunch ally who had fought for the same justice they sought. But now, it seemed like Alan had been playing both sides all along. But John wasn't buying it. He leaned in, his voice low. "I'm not asking for your opinion on the media. I'm asking if you're behind this." Marcus' smile faltered, and for a split second, John saw the truth in his eyes. There was guilt there. But just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by a defensive posture. "I'm not behind anything," Marcus said, his voice rising. "You need to be careful with these accusations, John. You don't know what you're dealing with. You're in over your head." John stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I don't have time for this, Marcus. I'm not asking you for an excuse. I'm asking you to step up and tell the truth." For a long moment, Marcus didn't respond. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "You'll regret this, John. You have no idea what you're up against." John's heart pounded as he turned and walked out of the cafe. He knew what had to be done. The truth would come out, one way or another. The fight was far from over. The betrayal was just the beginning. The days after John's confrontation with Marcus were filled with a lingering sense of unease. Marcus' words echoed in his mind, a cold warning that made everything feel more dangerous. "You have no idea what you're up against." The phrase was haunting. It wasn't just a warning about the media or about the struggle they were facing. It felt like something deeper, something more sinister. But John couldn't afford to focus on the fear. He had to keep moving, keep pushing forward. The rally had done its job. It had ignited a fire in the hearts of people across the country. But now, The movement was under attack. From the inside. And if there was one thing John knew all too well, it was how to fight when the enemy was already inside your walls. Rachel had been working tirelessly to dig into the leak, but the information was coming in slow, like a trickle that could barely keep up with the storm. But she wasn't about to give up. Every lead she followed, every person she spoke to, only fueled her determination. She knew they had to get to the truth before everything came crashing down. One afternoon, as Rachel sifted through emails and old notes from their early meetings, she stumbled upon something. It was a message, a cryptic email sent to Marcus from an anonymous source. The email contained detailed information about their upcoming events, internal strategies, and even personal details about the families involved in the movement. At the bottom of the email was a short, simple sentence: "You know what to do." John didn't know what to feel: betrayal, shock, anger. All of it hit him at once. But he couldn't afford to dwell on the emotions. He had to act. The truth needed to come out. "I'm coming to you," John said, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "We need to talk to Alan. If he's involved, we need to confront him directly." Rachel's voice was sharp with caution. "John, this is huge. Alan's not just some supporter. He's deeply connected, not just with the legal world, but with powerful figures in the media. If he's been working against us, we're going to need solid evidence, and we need to be careful how we approach him." "I don't care," John replied, his voice cold. "This is about justice. I don't care who Alan is connected to. He's not going to destroy everything we've worked for. We'll expose him." The next day, John and Rachel made their move. They arranged a meeting with Alan under the pretense of discussing the next steps in their campaign. Alan had been too busy with legal matters to attend the recent rallies, but he had stayed involved in the background. He agreed to meet them at a cafe, the same place where John had confronted Marcus. As they waited for Alan to arrive, John couldn't help but feel a mix of dread and determination. This was the moment of truth. If Alan was indeed the mastermind behind the leak, they had to confront him head-on. When Alan walked in, he was all smiles, his polished demeanor as flawless as ever. He greeted them both with a firm handshake, but there was something different about him today, something more guarded, more wary. He was aware of the storm that was brewing, even if he wasn't ready to admit it. "So, what's this about, John?" Alan asked, sitting down across from them. "I hope everything's going well with the campaign. You know, I've been trying to get things back on track, but there's a lot of moving parts, a lot of people involved." John didn't waste any time. "Cut the act, Alan. We know about the emails. We know you've been feeding information to the media. We know you're working with Marcus. What's going on?" Alan's face paled slightly, and for a moment, his smile faltered. He knew he was caught, but instead of denying it, he leaned back in his chair, almost as if he had been expecting this moment. "I'm sorry it had to come to this," Alan said, his voice low. "But you have to understand, John, there's a bigger game being played here. You're not the only one with ambitions. You never understood how far this could go, how much power is involved." John's stomach churned as Alan spoke, but he didn't back down. "What power? You sold out, Alan. You betrayed these families. You betrayed me." "I didn't betray you, John. I was just trying to make sure the right people got what they wanted," Alan said, his tone calculating. "You were too focused on justice. You didn't see the bigger picture. Now, you'll understand. It's not just about getting the truth out. It's about who controls the truth." John felt his blood boil, but he forced himself to remain calm. He could see now that Alan wasn't going to give up without a fight. But neither was John. He had come too far to let this betrayal end their movement. As they left the cafe, John was more resolved than ever. This battle wasn't just about fighting for justice anymore. It was about survival. They had to expose Alan, Marcus, and anyone else involved in this scheme. The truth would come out, no matter what. But the question was, what would happen next? The confrontation with Alan had been a turning point, but it was only the beginning. John felt the weight of the revelations pressing down on him, the enormity of the battle ahead starting to sink in. Alan had played his cards, revealing the deeper stakes at play. The powerful figures lurking in the shadows, pulling the strings behind the scenes. But John wasn't about to let that intimidate him. He had come too far to back down now. As the days passed, John and Rachel worked relentlessly, connecting the dots, following every lead. They knew they had to act fast before Alan or Marcus could do any more damage. But every move they made seemed to attract more attention, more scrutiny. The media, already eager to see them falter, pounced on any hint of scandal, and the public's faith in the movement began to waver. Rachel's determination, though, was unwavering. "We can't let them win, John. We have to expose Alan. If we don't, everything we've worked for will be for nothing." John nodded, his jaw set. He couldn't shake the memory of Alan's smug expression as he had tried to justify his actions. "We'll expose him, but we need more than just his confession. We need concrete proof." Rachel agreed. They had enough evidence to prove Alan's involvement in the leak, but they needed something that would silence the critics for good. They needed to show the world the corruption that lay beneath the surface, to reveal the truth about the people who had been manipulating the system for their own gain. The clock was ticking, and the pressure was mounting. John knew they needed to take the fight directly to the people. He had learned over the years that the media could be as much an ally as an enemy, but they had to control the narrative. With the help of a few trusted journalists, John and Rachel arranged a live-streamed press conference, an opportunity to expose Alan's betrayal and the web of corruption that had ensnared their cause. They couldn't let Alan or Marcus control the story any longer. It was time to take back the narrative. The day of the press conference arrived, and the atmosphere was electric with tension. The room was packed with reporters, cameras flashing, the murmur of conversation filling the space. John and Rachel stood at the front, their faces determined but solemn. This was their moment, the moment when they would take everything they had learned and finally confront those responsible for the lies. John took the podium first, his heart pounding as he faced the sea of cameras. He knew the stakes. He had been through intense moments of pressure in his life, but this was different. This wasn't just about him. It was about every family, every person who had been wrongfully convicted, every life that had been upended by a broken system. "Good afternoon," John began, his voice steady but strong. "I stand before you today not as a man who has been wronged, but as a man fighting for justice, for the families of the wrongfully convicted, for the innocent lives that have been shattered by a system that has failed them." There was a hushed silence in the room as John continued, his gaze focused and unwavering. "But what I'm here to tell you today is that the fight for justice is not just about the truth being told. It's about the truth being fought for, no matter the cost. And that fight has been undermined. There are people who have been working behind the scenes to sabotage this movement. People we trusted." He turned toward Rachel, who nodded, taking a deep breath as she prepared to share what they had uncovered. "I've spent the last few days looking into the leaks, talking to people who were close to the heart of this movement," Rachel began. "And I've discovered something I never thought I'd find: corruption within our own ranks." The tension in the room was palpable as Rachel revealed the details of their investigation. The emails, the connections, the way Alan and Marcus had been feeding information to the media in exchange for power and influence. "But it doesn't stop there," Rachel continued. "There's a larger web, a network of people with ties to powerful media figures and corporate sponsors who have a vested interest in seeing this movement fail." The reporters were on edge, scribbling down notes, their eyes wide as the magnitude of the revelation sank in. "We've been fighting against a broken system," John said, stepping forward again. "But we've also been fighting against people who have used their power to manipulate that system for their own gain. And today, we expose them. Alan and Marcus are just the tip of the iceberg." The press conference sent shockwaves through the media, dominating headlines across the country. For the first time in weeks, John felt a glimmer of hope. The truth was finally out. The public now knew the extent of the betrayal. Alan and Marcus couldn't hide anymore. But even as the world reacted to the revelations, John knew the battle wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. Exposing Alan and Marcus was only the first step. The fight for justice wasn't going to be easy, and it was going to require every ounce of strength he had. As the press conference came to an end and the room emptied, John and Rachel took a moment to breathe. They had done it. They had exposed the corruption that had threatened everything they had worked for. But there was still more to do. John turned to Rachel, his expression serious but grateful. "We did it, but now we need to focus on what comes next." Rachel nodded, her face tired but resolute. The fight for justice isn't over, but we've made a dent. People are starting to wake up, and that's all that matters. John knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult. The media would spin their own version of events, and the powers that be would do everything in their power to silence them. But John had come too far to back down. He had seen firsthand the damage caused by a broken system, and he couldn't let those responsible escape the consequences. In the end, it wasn't just about exposing the truth. It was about creating a movement, a legacy, that could change the way people thought about justice and accountability. It was about showing the world that the fight for what was right was worth every sacrifice. As the days passed, the movement continued to grow. People from all walks of life joined the cause, rallying behind the message that justice shouldn't be a privilege, but a right. Families of the wrongfully convicted spoke out, their voices amplified by the exposure of the corruption that had so long kept them silent. And though the battle was far from over, John knew one thing for sure: the truth had power, and together they would fight to make sure it was heard. The press conference had been a victory, a resounding moment of clarity in a storm of lies. For the first time in a long while, John felt like the momentum had shifted in their favor. The public, the media, and even some of the key figures who had been skeptical before were beginning to rally around the cause. The truth had come to light, and with it came the hope that the system could still be changed, that justice could still prevail. But just as the light seemed to break through the clouds, darkness began to creep in again. The first sign of trouble came 2 days after the press conference, when Rachel received a chilling phone call. It wasn't from a reporter, nor was it from any of their supporters. It was from a voice that she had hoped never to hear again: Marcus. "John, we're being hunted," Rachel said one evening, her voice tight with concern as she showed him the latest message she had received. "This is bigger than we thought." John's fists clenched, his anger rising. "They want us to back down. They want us to be afraid." "We can't back down," Rachel said firmly. "We can't let them win." John took a deep breath, trying to keep his emotions in check. He knew the stakes were higher than ever, but now wasn't the time to lose focus. They had come too far to give up now. "We need to take this to the next level," John said, his voice low but determined. "We need to expose everything, every connection, every person involved. We have to bring the whole system to its knees." But the fight was far from simple. As John and Rachel dug deeper into the connections between Marcus and the shadowy figures behind the leaks, they uncovered something that shook them to their core: evidence of widespread corruption that extended far beyond what they had initially thought. The leaks, the media manipulation, the threats, it was all part of a much larger scheme designed to discredit anyone who dared to challenge the status quo. Alan and Marcus were just pawns in a game that involved some of the most powerful figures in politics, business, and law enforcement. They had been using their positions to control the narrative, to silence dissent, and to protect their own interests. And now, John and Rachel had become the next targets. It was clear now that they weren't just fighting for justice, they were fighting for their lives. As they continued their investigation, John and Rachel realized that they could no longer fight this battle alone. They needed help, trusted allies who could help them navigate the dangerous waters they were now swimming in. But reaching out to others was risky. They had to be careful whom they trusted. After much deliberation, they decided to turn to the one person who had always been on the fringes of their movement: the mysterious tech billionaire, Elon Musk. They had met him once at a fundraiser, and although their interaction had been brief, John had been impressed by Musk's intelligence and his outspoken views on justice and corruption. "Maybe it's time to call in a favor," Rachel suggested one night, her fingers hovering over the keys of her laptop. "Musk has the resources, the influence. He could help us." John hesitated, unsure. "Do you really think he'll get involved? He's got his own empire to worry about." "I knew you'd come after me," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You've only seen the tip of the iceberg, Rachel. You've exposed some dirty laundry, but you're too naive to understand what's really at stake. You're playing a game that's much bigger than you." Rachel's heart skipped a beat. She knew what this meant. Marcus was on the attack, and this time, he wasn't going to back down. "What are you talking about, Marcus?" Rachel demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. "We've got you. We've got the proof. You can't hide anymore. You think exposing me is going to make everything better? Marcus scoffed. You've just stepped into a war you're not ready for. And let me tell you, Rachel, this war is going to cost you more than you're willing to pay. The call ended abruptly, leaving Rachel staring at her phone in disbelief. She turned to John, who had been pacing in the other room. She relayed the conversation, her face pale, a mix of frustration and fear clouding her expression. John's eyes narrowed as he processed the information. Marcus isn't going to let this go. He knows he's on the losing side now, and he's not going down without a fight. Rachel shook her head. This isn't just about Marcus anymore, is it? He's talking about a bigger war. We're dealing with people who are pulling the strings behind the scenes. John's jaw tightened, the weight of the situation sinking in. They had just exposed a small part of a much larger, far more dangerous operation. But Marcus's warning was clear. They hadn't just crossed a line. They had started a war with forces that could destroy everything they had worked for. The next few days were a blur of mounting tension. John and Rachel knew they had to stay on the offensive, but they also knew they had to be careful. If Marcus and his allies were as powerful as they seemed, they couldn't afford any more slip-ups. They had to outmaneuver them, stay one step ahead. But as they prepared for their next move, the blows kept coming. First, it was the media. Reports began surfacing, some of them questioning the integrity of the movement, while others accused John of using the press conference to push his own personal agenda. The attacks were relentless, and it seemed like every time they tried to get ahead, something new came out of the woodwork to drag them back down. Then, there were the threats. Anonymous messages began flooding Rachel's phone and social media accounts. Cryptic warnings, threats against her safety, and disturbing images that made it clear that they were being watched. It was as if Marcus's network of supporters had infiltrated every corner of their lives. Rachel nodded. But if anyone can help us take on the people who are trying to destroy us, it's him. The next morning, they sent a carefully crafted message to Elon Musk, outlining their situation and the corruption they had uncovered. They knew the risk of reaching out, but they also knew that they had no other choice. If they didn't get help, they might not survive this battle. As they waited for a response, the tension continued to mount. They knew that time was running out. Marcus and his allies were growing desperate. The threats were escalating, and it was only a matter of time before they made their next move. It was late in the evening when Elon Musk's reply finally came through. The message was short but direct. I've read your message. I'll help you. But this isn't going to be easy. We're going to have to fight dirty. John and Rachel exchanged a look, a mix of relief and apprehension. This was it. They had crossed a line, and now there was no turning back. The war for justice had escalated. The enemy had struck back, but John and Rachel weren't about to surrender. With Elon Musk on their side, they were ready for the fight of their lives. But the question remained. How far would they have to go to bring down the powerful forces working against them? The phone buzzed on the table, the screen lighting up with Elon Musk's reply. John stared at the message for a moment longer than he meant to. The weight of the decision they'd just made, the choice to bring Musk into their fight, was massive. But deep down, John knew they had no other choice. They had gone up against the system, and now the system was striking back. They needed an ally who could not only stand toe-to-toe with the corruption, but who also understood the stakes of this battle. Musk, for all his eccentricities, was someone who'd fought powerful interests before, someone who'd taken on the establishment and survived. But would he really help them? Or was this just another move in a much larger game? Did he reply? Rachel asked, her voice full of the usual mixture of hope and skepticism that had been growing between them lately. John showed her the message, his expression unreadable. Rachel let out a slow breath as she read it, nodding to herself. Well, it's a start. But what exactly does fighting dirty mean, John? We're already treading a fine line. John ran his fingers through his hair, pacing back and forth. It's not about being dirty. It's about being strategic. We've got to outsmart them, get ahead of their game. If Musk is in, we'll have the resources to do it, but we'll need to think long-term. This fight isn't just about one big blow. It's about staying in the game, being relentless. Rachel nodded. I just want to make sure we're not stepping into something that's going to be harder to get out of. We can't trust everyone, John. I know, John said, his voice firm. But Musk has the power to push back against people like Marcus and Alan. He knows what's at stake. He doesn't back down from a fight. The next few days were spent preparing for their next move. Musk was already making calls to his contacts, trying to gather intel on Marcus and the key players behind the network of corruption they were up against. He had the resources, the reach, and the connections. But it was also clear that this fight was going to require more than just money and influence. It would take guts, the kind of determination that John and Rachel had in spades, but they would need to leverage every advantage they could find. They began coordinating with a small group of trusted individuals, journalists, activists, and even a few former law enforcement officials who had grown disillusioned with the system. The more people they brought in, the more dangerous things became. They had to tread carefully, building their network while also ensuring they weren't exposing themselves to even more danger. But they had no choice. "The clock's ticking," Rachel said one afternoon as they met with their allies at a secure location, a small cafe in a hidden corner of the city. "Marcus and Alan are probably already making their next move. We can't waste any time." John leaned in, his gaze sharp. "We need to take control of the narrative. The press is turning on us, and we've got to stay ahead of the story. Every time they catch us off guard, they win. We need to start pushing back, exposing more of the corruption, and using the media to our advantage." A reporter sitting across from them, a young woman named Emily, looked at them with a mixture of curiosity and determination. "We're ready to go public with what you've given us. But you have to understand, the media won't play nice. They'll twist things, try to tear you down. If we're going to do this, we need to be prepared for backlash." John exchanged a look with Rachel, then nodded. "We're ready. We'll control the narrative, but we need all of you to do your part. The world needs to know the truth. We're counting on you." As they began to take their plan into action, things started to move at an incredible pace. Musk's team was uncovering financial connections between Marcus and several high-powered political figures, including the fact that Marcus had been laundering money through off-the-books donations to influential PACs and using his network to push legislation that benefited certain powerful corporations. It was a tangled web, but they were starting to pull the threads apart. Rachel spent hours combing through leaked emails and financial records, piecing together the evidence they'd need. John focused on speaking with key figures in the media, making sure that the message they were pushing was clear and consistent. It was exhausting, but they were making headway. For the first time in weeks, they had a real shot at winning this war. But the more they dug, the more dangerous it became. The threats escalated, moving from anonymous messages to more direct intimidation. One night, as Rachel was leaving her apartment, a black car pulled up alongside her. The window rolled down, and she saw the grim face of one of Marcus's associates, a man she'd recognized from their earlier encounters. "You think you're going to win this?" he sneered, his voice low, menacing. "You're playing with fire, lady. You don't know what you're up against." Rachel's heart raced, but she didn't flinch. "I know exactly what I'm up against, and I'm not backing down." The man grinned, showing a row of teeth that looked more threatening than reassuring. "We'll see how long you last." With that, he rolled up the window and drove off, leaving Rachel standing in the dark, the weight of his words hanging in the air. She took a deep breath and called John immediately. "It's getting worse, John. They're not going to stop. We've got to keep moving." John's voice crackled through the phone, tense. "We won't stop. We're in this together." Back at their headquarters, which was now a hastily secured office space, John, Rachel, and their allies gathered to strategize. They were on the cusp of breaking through. Musk's team had uncovered a key piece of evidence, a financial transfer that linked Marcus directly to a senior law enforcement official who had been helping him cover up the leaks and bribing officials to push the media's narrative. This was the breakthrough they needed. "If we release this now, it could be enough to get the authorities involved," Emily said, her fingers hovering over her laptop's keyboard. "But the timing's critical. If we do it too early, they'll cover it up. If we wait too long, we risk them getting ahead of us." John nodded. "We have to release it at the right moment. We'll use the media to our advantage, get the story out and keep it out. They won't be able to bury it this time." The war for the truth was far from over. But with the evidence they had, the allies they'd gained, and the determination to fight back, John and Rachel had a chance. The next step would be the hardest, exposing the people at the very top, taking down the system that had kept them in the shadows for so long. But they weren't backing down now. They were ready to bring it all into the light. The day the evidence was about to be released, the air in the office felt heavy with anticipation. The room was filled with a quiet, nervous energy. Every member of the team knew that this moment could change everything. It was the culmination of weeks of painstaking work, late nights, and endless hours of chasing leads. If they played their cards right, they could take down Marcus, Alan, and the entire network of corruption that had been operating behind the scenes. But with the stakes this high, they all knew there was no room for mistakes. One wrong move, and everything could crumble. Rachel sat at the head of the table, staring at her phone. The screen flickered to life as she received an encrypted message from Elon Musk's team. "It's time. Release the evidence." Her heart pounded in her chest. This was it, the moment that could make or break everything they'd worked for. She looked up at John, who stood by the window, his arms crossed as he gazed out into the city. The same city that had now become the battleground for their war. He turned toward her, catching her eye. "Ready?" he asked, his voice steady but with an underlying tension. Rachel nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "As ready as we'll ever be." The plan was simple. Release the financial documents and emails linking Marcus to the corrupt law enforcement official, then use the media to amplify the story. The key was timing. Everything had to happen in a synchronized burst to ensure the story couldn't be buried. They had the evidence, the press contacts, and the leverage of Elon Musk's influence to make sure it got out to the right people. But as Rachel hit the button to send the final message to the journalists, a cold shiver ran down her spine. There was no going back now. She couldn't help but wonder if this was the moment they had been waiting for, or the beginning of something far worse. John's phone buzzed with a new message, and he quickly checked it. His face grew pale as he read the contents. "They know," he muttered under his breath. "What do you mean?" Rachel asked, her voice tight with concern. "They're moving," John said, his voice low. "They're already trying to discredit the story. Marcus must have gotten wind of the plan. We've got to move fast." Before Rachel could respond, her phone buzzed, too. It was a news alert, breaking. New leaked documents suggest high-level police corruption in local law enforcement. Authorities say investigation underway. The story was out. The battle for the truth had begun, and the media was already reacting. But even as the story broke, it became clear that they were facing opposition on an unprecedented scale. The next few hours were a blur of chaos. Rachel and John were glued to their phones, fielding calls from reporters, allies, and even a few threats. Some of the journalists they had worked with had already started running the story, while others seemed hesitant, worried about potential legal ramifications. Then, as they had feared, the counterattack came. A new headline flashed on the screen. "Allegations against local law enforcement are part of a larger conspiracy. Authorities deny claims. Investigation into whistleblower underway." John cursed under his breath. "They're trying to flip the narrative. They're framing us as the bad guys." Rachel felt a sinking feeling in her stomach. The deeper they dug, the more ruthless their enemies became. It wasn't just about Marcus or Alan anymore. It was about the system that protected them, the people who benefited from this corruption, and the network of powerful figures who would stop at nothing to maintain control. "They're coming for us," Rachel said, her voice almost a whisper. "We knew they would," John replied grimly. "But we have to stand our ground. This isn't just about taking down Marcus. It's about taking down the system. We can't let them win." As they worked into the night, the team grew more and more desperate to keep their narrative alive. Every time they released a new piece of evidence, their enemies pushed back harder. Marcus's network had deep roots, and it wasn't just limited to local law enforcement. They had allies in the highest echelons of government, in corporate boardrooms, and in the media. It was a full-scale war, and they were fighting on all fronts. But just when it seemed like they were losing the battle, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Musk's team had been working tirelessly behind the scenes, and late that evening, they discovered something that could turn the tide. In one of the leaked documents, they found the name of an influential business tycoon, someone with direct ties to Marcus and the network they had been investigating. The tycoon was not only funding corrupt law enforcement operations, but also had a history of manipulating public opinion through media channels. It was a direct link to the very heart of the corruption they were fighting. This was the missing piece, the evidence they needed to expose the mastermind behind it all. "John, we have it," Rachel said, her voice shaking with a mix of disbelief and triumph. "We've got the smoking gun." John looked at the document Rachel had just sent him, his eyes scanning the details. "This is it. This is what we've been waiting for." They quickly made their next move, releasing the full extent of the evidence to the media. The story was explosive. Not only did it implicate Marcus, but it also tied him to a vast network of corrupt power players who had been manipulating the system for years. The documents showed that the tycoon had been orchestrating everything from behind the scenes, using his wealth and influence to protect the criminals and stifle any opposition. The media coverage exploded. The public reaction was swift and intense. For the first time in months, the narrative shifted entirely. People were demanding answers. The authorities could no longer ignore the evidence. It was all out in the open. The people had spoken, and they were not willing to accept the status quo any longer. As the hours passed, the political fallout was swift. Government officials who had previously supported Marcus began distancing themselves from him. Law enforcement agencies, under intense pressure, announced they were launching full investigations into the corruption. Even the media outlets that had tried to discredit Rachel and John began to report the truth. But even in the wake of this victory, John and Rachel knew the battle wasn't over. The fight for justice was still ongoing, and while they had exposed the masterminds behind the scheme, the consequences of this revelation were far from clear. They had taken down the powerful network that had controlled them for so long, but at what cost? The system they had fought so hard to bring down was still deeply entrenched. And while they had won this round, there was no guarantee that they wouldn't be facing even greater challenges ahead. Rachel and John sat together in the office, their eyes fixed on the news reports flashing across the screen. The room was quiet for a long moment before Rachel finally spoke. "We did it," she said softly. "We did," John replied, though his voice was filled with uncertainty. "But the war's not over. We've exposed the truth, but now we have to make sure it sticks. We have to keep fighting." Rachel nodded. "And we will. But no matter what happens from here on out, we've already won something more important than we ever could have imagined. We've shown people that the system can be brought down." For the first time in months, they allowed themselves a moment of peace, a quiet victory. But deep down, they both knew the fight for justice had only just begun. The days following the explosive reveal felt surreal. The world had changed, or at least the world that John and Rachel had fought so hard to dismantle had. As the investigation into Marcus, Alan, and the network of corruption spread like wildfire, both of them struggled to keep up with the tidal wave of media requests, public interest, and government pressure. They had exposed the powerful, hidden forces at play, and now those forces were starting to crack. But even as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, the weight of what was to come still loomed large. John stood at the window of their temporary safe house, watching the lights of the city flicker beneath the stars. It was a strange moment of peace, one that felt too quiet after the storm of chaos they had lived through. His thoughts kept drifting to everything they had lost and everything they had gained. Beside him, Rachel stepped up to the window, her face reflecting the same mixture of exhaustion and relief. "Hard to believe we're here, isn't it?" she said softly. "All that effort, all those risks, and now it's out in the open. But I can't shake the feeling that we're still not done yet." John turned to her, his expression grim but hopeful. "No, we're not done. The truth is out, but the system's still broken. This is just one battle in a much larger war. We can't stop now, Rachel. We have to make sure the people who did this never have the power to hurt anyone again." Rachel nodded, her eyes locked onto his. "And we will. But we've come a long way. I don't know if you've realized this, but everything we've done, every step, every risk, it wasn't just for us. It was for everyone who's been ignored, exploited, or crushed by the system. We gave them a voice." John smiled faintly. "You're right. We've shown them that change is possible." Days turned into weeks, and the ripple effect of their victory continued. The investigation into Marcus and his network expanded, with more and more people coming forward, exposing corruption that had long been hidden. The media, once quick to discredit them, now found themselves in a position where they couldn't ignore the truth. Public opinion had shifted, and the people, empowered by the revelation, began demanding real change. Elon Musk's involvement had given them the platform and influence they needed to elevate the story to new heights, but it was the sheer determination of ordinary citizens that had kept the pressure on. They had become the loudest voices in the room, the ones who refused to be silenced. It was a collective victory, not just theirs alone. But as the truth continued to unfold, John and Rachel faced a new kind of challenge. The phone call came late one evening. It was a number they didn't recognize, but when John answered, he was met with a familiar voice on the other end. "John, Rachel," Elon Musk's voice crackled through the line. "I just wanted to check in. Things are moving fast, and we've got some big decisions to make. There are still powerful people trying to push back against this, people who are trying to control the narrative. We need to be ready for whatever comes next." Rachel's voice was calm, but there was a sharp edge to it. "We knew it wouldn't be easy. The real fight has just begun. What's next?" Elon was silent for a moment before responding. "It's going to get worse before it gets better. Marcus and the others aren't going to take this lying down. They're already working on their counterattack. But here's the thing. This story is bigger than all of them, and we have the truth on our side. What we need now is to turn this momentum into something that lasts. Real change. If we can expose the system's flaws, maybe we can fix them." John sighed, his mind racing. "And how do we do that?" Elon's voice was unwavering. "We don't just stop at Marcus. We go after the root of it all. We push for policy changes. We expose the connections between the powerful corporations and government officials. We get involved in the legislation that will prevent this from happening again. If we want real change, we need to rebuild the system, not just tear it down." Rachel exchanged a look with John, and they both knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was clear. They had to fight for something bigger than just their personal quest for justice. "We're in," Rachel said. "Let's finish this." The next few months saw the rise of a movement, one that John and Rachel hadn't anticipated. They started meeting with lawmakers, journalists, and activists, working together to propose new legislation that would reform the legal system, increase transparency in politics, and hold the corrupt individuals who had been revealed accountable. Elon Musk's influence brought an unexpected amount of weight to the cause, but it was clear that this battle would take years, not months. They also helped establish a non-profit organization aimed at fighting corruption, supporting whistleblowers, and advocating for systemic change. It wasn't just about exposing the bad guys. It was about creating an environment where such corruption couldn't thrive in the first place. Despite the continued threats from powerful individuals who sought to maintain the status quo, the momentum was unstoppable. The people had awakened, and there was no turning back. John and Rachel found themselves in a new chapter of their lives, one where the fight for justice never truly ended. They had seen the depths of corruption, but they had also witnessed the incredible strength of those who refused to accept that corruption as their fate. They had exposed the truth, but now they had to build something better in its place. As they stood together in the heart of the city, watching the people go about their lives, John felt a strange sense of peace. This wasn't just their victory, it was everyone's victory. And while they knew that challenges would come, they also knew that they had made a difference. The world was changing, and they were part of it. Rachel turned to him, her voice filled with resolve. "We've done something incredible, John, but this is just the beginning." John smiled, a weight lifting from his shoulders. The beginning of a new world. And for the first time in a long while, he believed it. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. John and Rachel have changed the world, but the fight for justice is never truly over. Will they continue to push for a better future, or will the powerful forces they've challenged strike back once again? What do you think? Let us know in the comments. Stay tuned for more.